On Decoration Day, May 30th, 1892, the city of Richmond, Virginia was inundated with Confederate veterans of the Civil War, as well as civilians from Virginia and other states. 2 years earlier, the city had unveiled a statue to Confederate General Robert E. Lee. This year, they were dedicating a statue to another Virginian and Confederate General, Ambrose Powell Hill. A 3-mile parade filled with veterans of many Southern regiments marched with shouldered muskets to the veiled statue. A little girl named Virginia Means, the granddaughter of General Hill's chief of staff, pulled the red cord which unveiled the statue to the crowd. One of Hill's biographers stated, "In 90 days he rose from colonel of the 13th Virginia Infantry Regiment to the rank of Major General in command of the Light Division, one of the largest and most distinguished in Lee's Army of Northern Virginia. Following the death of his celebrated chief, Stonewall Jackson, he was promoted to Lieutenant General in charge of the newly formed 3rd Corps. Lee constantly relied on him as a troubleshooter and ranked him next to Jackson and Longstreet among his commanders. Hill's habitat was the battlefield. He possessed what one compatriot termed an unquenchable thirst for battle, and nothing exhilarated him like the fierce joy of victorious fight. Hill's battle attire included a picturesque red shirt, black felt slouch hat, and a drawn sword. Once the battle was joined, he was bold, skillful, tenacious, and utterly oblivious to his personal safety. Even though fierce in battle, he extended every courtesy and consideration to a captured or fallen foe. In appearance, he stood 5 feet 10 inches and weighed about 160 pounds. His frame was so slight that President Jefferson Davis referred to him as Little A.P. Hill. His handsome face was graced with long curling hair and a luxuriant red beard which, like Stuart's, disguised his youth. High cheekbones, a Roman nose, and intense hazel eyes which blazed when angry and lit up with a steely glint in battle were relieved by a slight but very pleasant smile which seemed to light up his face all the time. His slender arms merged into long, slightly tapering virile hands. Despite his service record, A.P. Hill has been overshadowed by other historical juggernauts of the South like Lee, Jackson, and Longstreet. Hill's ancestors arrived along the Virginia coast in the 1600s and were successful tobacco growers. Russell Hill would move into the Virginia wilderness in 1740 to Culpeper, Virginia, and established a homestead known as Stranger's Rest. Russell's son Henry served under Light Horse Harry Lee during the American Revolution and would marry the daughter of adventurer and surveyor Captain Ambrose Powell, of which the Powell Valley that runs from Virginia into Tennessee is named, as well as the river that runs through it. Their son, Thomas Hill, would be a leading politician and merchant in Culpeper County. Thomas married Fanny Russell Baptist, and she would give birth to Ambrose Powell Hill on November 9, 1825, named after the child's great-grandfather. As he got older, he would attend a neighborhood school, then progress to Bleak Hill Seminary. He bonded with his mother because of their mutual love of books. She and the rest of the family would call him Powell. His reading list consisted of the Bible, Shakespeare, vast amounts of poetry, novels, and histories of Napoleon's military exploits. Although they bonded over books, her hypochondria made her children keep their distance as they got older. Hill spent time hunting and fishing with his tall father. They enjoyed riding together, and his riding ability was noticed by his subordinates years later. One wrote, "He was a perfect picture in the saddle and the most graceful rider I ever saw." When he was 15, an evangelical preacher named Ireland proselytized the Virginians around Culpeper and brought them into the Baptist New Light movement, including Hill's mother and father. After that, cards, dancing, and the theater were added to the forbidden list in the Hill household. Ambrose sought to get out from under his parents' strict rules by gaining an appointment to West Point. His vast reading of military exploits by Napoleon and his own family military history convinced him that that was the best route for him to go. Through his father's political power, Ambrose, against his mother's objections, obtained an appointment by politician John S. Barber. When he left his Culpeper home for New York, his father gave him a Bible. Inscribed inside was the words, "Ambrose Powell Hill. Peruse this every day." His mother's gift was unique. It was a small ham bone, which was a good luck charm. He would carry it his entire life. Ambrose Powell Hill would arrive at West Point in 1842 to begin his military studies. During the summer encampment, Hill would share a room with George B. McClellan. They quickly became good friends. Some of his other classmates were Burkitt D. Fry, Dabney H. Maury, Thomas Jonathan Jackson, George Pickett, and Cadmus Wilcox. Hill and Jackson were never friends at West Point. Hill was of a higher social status in Virginia than Jackson, and both knew it. While Jackson had to study long and hard to survive West Point, education came easier to Hill. Jackson scorned levity. Hill sought a good time. Jackson practiced religion with a fervor that Hill detested. Once they survived the summer encampment and entrance exam, the school year started, and the mornings were spent learning algebra, geometry, and trigonometry, while the afternoons would be passed learning French. In early January, the students took their semi-annual examinations that lasted from 8 until 1, then from 2 till 4. One student described it as the long agony, but Hill was able to overcome the examination. He longed for some affection from his parents around this time. After 9 months, he had received no letter or any communication from his mother or father. He begged them to write or to visit, but he was not optimistic. After finishing his second year, he was able to go home for the first time after entering West Point. He spent a relaxing 2 months with family, then proceeded to New York City, spent a short time in the city, then steamed up the Hudson River to the academy. Shortly after arriving, he was admitted into the academy hospital with gonorrhea contracted on furlough. He most likely acquired it while in New York City. The superintendent warned the students not to stay in the city and warned them against harems of pleasure in Church and Mercer streets. Treatment at the time consisted of regular doses of a thick, yellowish-brown, spicy-smelling liquid with an ungodly taste used for everything under the sun, but it was a useless treatment. In some people, gonorrhea runs its course and leaves no lasting effects, but in the weeks to follow, Hill experienced more severe symptoms: severe pelvic pain, fever, and difficulty urinating. The urethral strictures produced by the gonococcus had led to painful prostatitis. He went home to recover, which took nearly a year. He would return to the academy in the fall of 1845, but had to repeat that year's studies, putting him in the graduating class of 1847 alongside Ambrose Burnside and fellow Virginian Harry Heath. In February, like all Februaries at West Point, the Army officers at the academy held a large dinner on George Washington's birthday, and out of courtesy to the cadets, would invite the cadet captain and adjutant to join them for the feast. This year, for some reason, there was no invitation. The entire class was offended. So Heath, William Wallace Burns, and the other cadet officers, including Hill, met in Hill's room. They conspired to ruin the dinner. The cadet officers broke into the mess hall with clothes bags and began to fill it with all the delicacies prepared for the dinner, including oranges, nuts, apples, wine, and cigars. Then they lugged it back to Hill's room. Heath and Burns volunteered to complete the crime. As one of the servers was walking the baked turkey from the kitchen to the officers' mess hall, Burns snuck up behind him and punched him right behind the ear. The man fell forward and the turkey fell right into Heath's arms. They carried it away to Hill's room, where the cadet officers dove into the food, wine, and cigars. One remembered later, "Never were 10 boys happier. Never did a turkey have, before or since, the flavor of this turkey." In 1847, graduating 15th out of a class of 38, Brevet Second Lieutenant Ambrose Powell Hill received his orders to join the light battery of the 1st U.S. Artillery. Hill had been depressed when the class of 1846, the class he should have been in, marched away to the war with Mexico. But now he would be joining the campaign as well. He first visited Culpeper, then traveled to New Orleans, where he got on a ship bound for Veracruz. Unfortunately, along the way, his ship collided with another ship, but his would right itself and continued on to Veracruz. When A.P. Hill set foot on Mexican soil, he was assigned to a cavalry detachment and ordered to join General Lane. When 2 wagons broke down on the way there, orders were issued for the men to stay with them until help arrived. Some of the raw troops grew impatient and urged Hill to push on. Several aggravated soldiers attempted to slip away, only to find the road blocked by Lieutenant Hill, mounted and pointing 2 cocked pistols at them. The mutineers decided to stay. Once he and the rest of the detachment made it to General Lane, Hill joined the battery he had been assigned out of West Point and received a promotion to second lieutenant on August 20th, 1847. While in Mexico, Hill adopted a flamboyant uniform. He wore a flaming red flannel shirt and coarse blue soldier's trousers stuffed into red-top boots, to which were attached an immense pair of Mexican spurs. On his head, at a jaunty angle, rested a huge sombrero. His weapons, hardly less conspicuous, were a long artillery saber, a pair of horse pistols in enormous leather holsters, plus a pair of revolvers and a butcher knife, all stuck in a wide black belt. By his own admission, Hill resembled something between a strutting bandito and a mobile arsenal. Near a small town, General Lane dispatched part of his army to attack a Mexican contingent, but Hill was left behind to guard the wagon train. After the engagement, General Lane turned his troops loose on the town. Hill remembered, "The soldiers, rendered furious by the resistance, rushed through town, breaking open stores, houses, and shops, loading themselves with the most costly articles, rendering themselves brutish by the drinking of aguardiente. The women, screaming and running about the streets, imploring protection, was a sight to melt a heart of stone." After seeing the horrible acts perpetrated by volunteers in the army, Hill thought of those types of soldiers in a different light, especially when he was expected to reprimand them. Around 200 soldiers were too drunk to get back to camp, and by the next morning, Hill and other officers had a difficult time getting them to resume the march. Hill said, "My arm was perfectly sore from beating them into obedience with both fist and sword." Hill did get to fight, but on a small scale, and he did witness the hanging of guerrillas and bandits ordered by General Winfield Scott. When the capital was captured, General Winfield Scott allowed his officers to obtain quarters at private residences. When Hill and a fellow officer attempted to board at a woman's house, the woman caused an uproar about letting Americans into her house. It was found out that this was a sister to Santa Anna, and Hill conveyed to her that if that information was found out by others, she might suffer, so she would be better off allowing the two men to stay there. Ambrose Powell Hill became engulfed in the flirtations of Mexican women. He wrote to his father that, "'Tis a fact that the ladies of Mexico are beautiful, and oh how beautiful, but very few of them have ever read Wayland's Moral Science. You know my failing. 'Tis an inheritance of this family, this partiality for the women." He even asked his parents, "How would you relish a Mexican daughter-in-law?" He became infatuated with Mexican women. He stated, "They have more beautiful feet, small almost to deformity, and the sweetest eyes in the world, but they have not the pure rosy complexion of ours. The lily vying with the carnation for the rivalry and lips on which kisses pout to leave." The other aspects of Mexico did not gain his favor like the ladies. He declared the male population expert robbers and assassins, as well as beggars. This mentality toward the populace made him write to his family that, "I believe they compose half the population of Mexico, and it has become a common saying that now we've whipped the people, we have got to support them." Beyond its people, Hill was constantly harassed by its insects. "The night spent here will ever be memorable in my history, for the terrible attack made on me by an army of fleas, and the great danger of my utter annihilation." In November 1847, he fell ill with typhoid fever. He battled with the horrible symptoms of fever, vomiting, severe headaches, and a total prostration for 6 weeks, but he made a full recovery. While in Mexico, Ambrose watched the national amusement known as bullfighting, but it did not sit well with him. "I went to see a bullfight last evening, and came away thoroughly disgusted with this great national amusement of the Mexicans. 'Tis a cruel, most cruel sport, and how the ladies can so defame those feelings given them by nature, as to look on with the utmost delight, cry bravo, and clap their pretty little hands, is a mystery to me. I have seen human blood flow in streams, but this turned me sick at heart." When the war with Mexico ended in 1848, Hill would return to the United States and be stationed at Fort McHenry in Maryland. Starting in the fall of 1849, Hill was transferred to Florida to battle the Seminoles. While there, he was appointed the quartermaster for the battery. He and the rest of the unit would chase groups of Native Americans into and through the mosquito-infested swamps of the Everglades and become fairly miserable while doing so. Hill wrote to his sister that "'twould be unwise in Uncle Sam to engage in such an expensive war as 'twould prove to be, and only to drive a few poor, lazy, harmless devils from the country that no white man could or would live in." The horrible insects of Florida, like the ones in Mexico, haunted him. He wrote in his diary, "My God, will these mosquitoes never satiate their vampirian appetite for blood? Buggy, buggy, buggy. There is no peace for the wicked, saith the good book. Mosquitoes were especially sent on earth as a torment to the wicked. Wonder if Noah had any in the ark with him." He did explore around his installation near Tampa Bay, Florida. On one of these trips, he visited an old woman's house with one of his comrades, went in and made ourselves at home, nearly split my throat bawling at the old woman who was deaf, and shamed my eyes looking love to her daughter who was confoundedly pretty. Wished to heaven that old woman had been blind instead of deaf. Moving through the dense foliage of western Florida, Hill accompanied a census taker and came to a small cabin with an incredible amount of children. My God, the eruption of the Huns into Italy would but feebly portray the living stream which gushed forth from the door to greet our arrival. While in the Sunshine State, Ambrose started to rely heavily on alcohol to get him through the day. One day after a long march, he had emptied his bottle and fell off his horse. Of course, he didn't remember that. His friends had to relay the story later. He remained in Florida until September 1851, when he was promoted to first lieutenant and briefly assigned to Fort Ricketts on the Texas frontier. His stay in the Lone Star State would be brief, as he found it a rough place. He explained, "I was in Brownsville but some 10 days, and 4 men were shot down in the streets. And this is the country to annex, which both blood and treasure has been poured out freely as the rains from heaven. My regret is that these residents do not destroy each other fast enough and finally shoot out the entire race. The world would be no loser, and certainly heaven no gainer." He wouldn't be in Texas long. Then it was back to Florida. He passed the monotonous time hunting, fishing, and reading. While in Florida, his mother passed away, and he was unable to attend the funeral. But he wrote her a loving letter informing her how much he cared about her and wanted her to recover. She would pass away in 1853. He finally got out of Florida, but not under good circumstances. An attack of yellow fever incapacitated him. Lieutenant John M. Schofield and some other officers took care of him at Fort Caprone's base hospital. Once he recovered enough to travel, he was to travel to Culpeper to recuperate. About that time, Schofield was transferred north, so they traveled together, but Schofield would be hit with a reoccurring bout of typhoid fever. Hill took care of him on their steamship ride to Savannah, then Charleston, where it was decided that Schofield would come home with Hill and remain there until well. Hill's father recommended a brandy mint julep start Schofield's day, and the young officer admitted that his recovery became more rapid with that prescription. While Ambrose was at home, he wrote directly to the Secretary of War, Jefferson Davis, to be transferred to the U.S. Coast Survey office in Washington. Davis granted him the transfer in November 1855. While at the Coast Survey office, he assisted a team studying the triangulation of the Hudson River between Albany and New Baltimore. Then he served as general assistant in the office and would run the office when his superior was absent. His superior wrote that Lieutenant A.P. Hill continues to occupy this position, and the interest as well as ability displayed by him in performing the requirements of the office cannot fail to meet your warmest commendation. Besides being a good soldier, Hill was good at romancing women. He wrote to his sister that to be in love with someone is as necessary to me as my dinner. His first love was Emma Wilson, a Baltimore schoolmate of his sister's at Patapsco Female Seminary in Ellicott City, Maryland. Hill courted her while stationed at Fort McHenry prior to his assignment to Florida. The relationship was ended because Wilson's family did not believe the Hills were of equal social status. His next serious courtship was while at the survey office. He courted the blonde-haired, blue-eyed Ellen Marcy, the daughter of Officer Randolph B. Marcy. Miss Nellie, as she was known, spent several winters in Washington, where she became noted for her charm and beauty. His competition for the affections of Nellie was none other than his former classmate, Captain George McClellan. McClellan had gained the respect and friendship of her father during the Red River expedition in 1852. Her parents liked George even more when he announced his intention to resign from the Army to become an executive of the Illinois Central Railroad. When McClellan proposed marriage, Nellie turned him down and began to spend more time with Hill. Rumors swirled that Hill and Nellie were engaged. Her father, stationed in Texas, wrote to his daughter, "In regard to Mr. Hill, I know but little of him. He seemed to be a gentlemanly man, and if he was not in the Army but engaged in some business that would ensure you a comfortable home, I should not have so much objection, but I should suppose you would have more ambition. I inquired about Mr. Hill's family at Corpus Christi, and I am inclined to believe that they are in very moderate circumstances, so far as property goes. I shall expect that you at once abandon all communication with Mr. Hill. If you do not comply with my wishes, in this respect I cannot tell you what my feelings toward you would become. I fear that my ardent affection would turn to hate." One way or another, Miss Marcy heard about Hill contracting gonorrhea and began to spread the word to her daughter. Hill took offense and wrote to Nellie's father that Miss Marcy's objections are that from certain early imprudences, youthful indiscretions I suppose, My health and constitution had become so impaired, so weakened, that no mother could yield her daughter to me unless to certain unhappiness. Although he did not quite deny the incident, he felt his honor and reputation would be destroyed if it became widely known. He also knew that such a rumor would ruin his chances with Nellie. Mr. Marcy apologized for his wife's actions, but in the end, Mr. Marcy and his wife would convince their daughter to break off the engagement, and she would end up with George McClellan in the end. A rumored statement made its way to McClellan during an 1885 reunion that when A.P. Hill's troops were wreaking havoc on McClellan's Army of the Potomac, that it was a reprisal for having lost the love of his life. It was said that a soldier rolled out of bed, fell into line, heard he would have to fight against Hill's men, and exclaimed, "My God, Nellie, why didn't you just marry him?" When McClellan heard this, he said, "Fiction, no doubt, but surely no one could have married a more gallant soldier than A.P. Hill." In 1857, Hill lost someone else. His father passed away. In April of that same year, he was a groomsman at a Richmond wedding of his West Point friend Henry Heath. It would also be in 1857 when Hill wrote to his sister Lucy that a little siren had thrown her net around him and to expect a wedding soon. The little siren was a wealthy young widow named Kitty Morgan McClung of Kentucky. They had met at a party of a mutual friend when Miss McClung had visited Washington, D.C. in 1857. The enslaved woman who took care of Kitty as a small child remarked that she looked like a doll and gave her the nickname Dolly, a name she would keep all her life. Hill would likewise call her Dolly. They began a courtship, and Hill fell hard for Dolly's blue eyes and chestnut hair. The young lady was 9 years younger than Hill, opinionated, and a great conversationalist. They matched incredibly well. Hill wrote to his friend George McClellan that, "I'm afraid there is no mistake about it this time, old fellow, and please God and Kentucky bluegrass, my bachelor life is about to end, and I shall swell the number of blessed martyrs who have yielded up freedom and crinoline and blue eyes. She is young, 24 years, gentle and amiable, yet lovely and sufficiently good-looking for me. I expect to be married in Lexington, Kentucky on the 18th of July, and if you could come down from Chicago, you know that there is no one whose presence would delight me more." The two would be married in Lexington, Kentucky at her family's home. Since no one in the Hill family could make it for the ceremony, his soon-to-be brother-in-law, John Hunt Morgan, stood as his best man. After a quick visit to Culpeper, the couple settled into their modest home in Washington, D.C. The next year, on May 22, 1860, George McClellan and Ellen Marcy were married in New York City. Hill was a groomsman in their wedding. Later that same year, Powell and Dolly welcomed their first child into the world, a little girl named Henrietta, but Hill would call her Nettie. The election of 1860 saw Abraham Lincoln become president-elect, and 6 Deep South states adopted secession as the best course of action. Hill saw outright war as imminent by January 2, 1861. He wrote to his sister, who was still living in Baltimore, stating, "Tell Carter to prepare to pack up his traps unless he desires to live in the Northern Confederacy, for surely the end is approaching." Hill worried that a war would make him take up arms against Virginia. His fellow officers at the Coast Survey insisted that if the war broke out, he would not be forced to take up arms, but this was a serious concern for the Virginian. He stated in 1847 that, "There is one regiment on which I would stake my life, and that is the one from dear old Virginia. I would fight for its honor and reputation as soon as for my own." But the deteriorating situation led him to resign on February 26, 1861. In his letters, he expressed his family's ties, disenchantment with the federal government, and allegiance to the land of his forefathers as the reasons for his leaving the United States military. Hill took his wife and little Nettie to Culpeper and stayed with his brother Baptist while the national crisis unfolded. When the news reached the Hill family about the firing on Fort Sumter, the 35-year-old Powell tendered his services to the governor of Virginia, John Letcher. He hoped that his experience would earn him general stars, but he found that to be out of the question. By the last week of April, Virginians, including Hill, were traveling to Harper's Ferry, the location where the Shenandoah and Potomac rivers meet, and the doorway to the Shenandoah Valley. He arrived by early May, and by the 9th had received appointment as the colonel of the 13th Virginia Infantry Regiment. He treated his soldiers and officers alike. He issued a warning on May 25th. The colonel, having requested that officers must attend the drill at 9:30, and some of them having failed to be present, he now orders that every officer of his regiment, not otherwise on duty, appear at this drill at 9:30. Any officer failing to appear and without good cause will be arrested and reported to headquarters, and the same order will hold good as to the evening parade. Hill was a strict disciplinarian. During a long march, it began to hail, but he refused to stop the march until they made it back to Harper's Ferry. The men marched back into town wet and sore from the storm, but they came to the realization that army life would be more difficult than they previously thought. The chaplain of the 13th asked Hill for permission to hold religious services. Hill refused. A good fighter now is more desirable than a good preacher. The preacher bemoaned the fact that between daily drill and nightly picket duty, he had no opportunity of wedging in a sermon. Many of his troops were getting drunk at a hotel in town, to the point of being unable to perform their duties. So he had an entire company enter the hotel and inform the owner that he must remove the alcohol or the troops would do it for him. Hill was easy to spot in Harper's Ferry. He detested wearing a full uniform, so he would be seen around town in a calico or checkered shirt which Dolly sewed for him, neatly polished black boots that came almost to the hip, and a black felt hat. His accoutrements were a narrow saber attached to a belt on one side, a revolver on the other side, and oversized buckskin gloves which he inclined to wear year-round, and he was growing a beard like many of the men of the period. At this early stage of the war, Powell rode a black stallion named Prince. In June, Federal forces began to operate along the Virginia and Maryland border, close to Hill's location. His commander, Joseph E. Johnston, would be sending Hill and other troops to Romney to confront Federal forces. In June 1861, Federal troops descended upon the town of Romney, about 43 miles from Confederate General Joseph E. Johnston's headquarters at Winchester, Virginia. Johnston sent A.P. Hill with the 13th and 10th Virginia Infantry Regiments, along with the 3rd Tennessee, but when they arrived at Romney, Federal troops had pulled back about 18 miles to New Creek. Not to be outdone, Hill sent a few companies from each regiment to New Creek, where a small skirmish occurred. Back in Romney, Hill's commissary officer reported that there was no beef to issue to his men as rations. Hill stated, "Very well, you can report back to your company. We have no earthly use for a commissary who in a rich country like this cannot furnish regular rations for the men." Hill mounted his horse and left camp. He would arrive sometime later, driving a herd of cattle into town. The men cheered their commander for his actions. In the expedition on Romney, Hill had commanded 3 regiments, followed orders explicitly, and performed well in his role. He desired promotion in the worst way. One of his political allies assured him that he was asserting all the political power he could in Richmond to get Hill promoted. Hill responded, "You will never succeed. President Davis does not like me. If he has his way, I will remain in command of my gallant little regiment until the war closes." An influx of new troops into Johnston's command brought Hill more disappointment. The commander reorganized his force into 4 brigades, under Thomas J. Jackson, Bernard B., Francis S. Bartow, and Hill's regiment under Arnold Elzey. He had been passed over for promotion. On the morning of July 18, 1861, orders came to break camp. Johnston had been ordered to join P.G.T. Beauregard's army near Manassas. A battle was imminent. Once at the junction, the 13th and Hill were detached from the brigade and sent to guard the railroad and the fords along Bull Run to the right of the Confederate line. Hill and his men despaired at the thought of missing out on the war. When the Union Army routed and the Confederate Army pursued, Hill's command saw no action and made it to Fairfax Courthouse, where they set up camp and performed monotonous guard duty. Although a dull time, Hill couldn't be happier in August because Dolly, who had went to live in Nashville with her uncle, gave birth to another daughter. She was named Frances Russell. Hill would call her Russie. Receiving word of her birth gave him great joy, and he quickly inquired about all the details about the new child. Although his thoughts were with his family, his body was subject to the hot, muggy weather around Fairfax Courthouse. His men starved due to commissary incompetence, and trainloads of sick soldiers suffering from typhoid fever, measles, and mumps left town. At one point, Hill's regiment was to march along the outer perimeter of the army. Hill was seen on numerous occasions during the march dismounting and letting weak or tired soldiers ride until the soldier regained their strength. A sergeant on guard duty fondly remembered that Hill came up to him noticed his weariness and offered to stand guard while the sergeant got some rest. In September, Hill was sick. His regiment did win some acclaim, though, when they took 8 federal prisoners without firing a shot during their time at Fairfax Courthouse. Performing essentially guard duty along the border between two nations was fairly boring work except for the occasional brush with the enemy. Hill made the comment that General E. Kirby Smith has assumed the command of our division of the Army, and I hope that his young and vigorous counsels may at least force us to be killed on the field rather than be dying of these pestilential fevers. Sickness then forced Hill temporarily to turn over command of the 13th Virginia to Major James B. Terrell, and this indisposition cost Hill another chance at military recognition. On September 11th, a federal force of 1,800 infantry and cavalry, along with a heavy battery, tried to establish an outpost at the village of Lewinsville. Jeb Stuart learned of the move and responded by advancing with 350 men of the 13th Virginia, a section of artillery, and 2 companies of cavalry. Stuart caught the Federals unprepared and sent the 13th Virginia charging into the exposed right flank. Fighting lasted about 90 minutes before the Union soldiers fled. While Stuart received most of the credit for the affair, Major Terrell got praise that would have gone to Hill had he not been struggling in Fairfax to regain his strength. A week later, Hill was back in command of the 13th, but he longed to see his family. By this point, Nashville had become unbearable for Dolly and the children, and she moved in with her family in Kentucky behind Union lines. There was no telling when the Hill family would be reunited. On September 19th, during a grand review for Johnston, the 13th Virginia was presented with a flag made from Dolly's wedding dress. A member of the regiment remembered, "The flag is a beautiful silk banner, the handiwork of the accomplished lady of our colonel, and will be prized and defended as the gift of a fair daughter of unhappy Kentucky, bidding us a hearty Godspeed in fighting the battles of the South." His unit moved close to Manassas Junction and stayed there into the winter. By November, Hill's family had been smuggled into Virginia and were in Culpeper. Powell went to visit them as soon as he could, but he had to get back to the ranks. When his brigade commander was absent, Hill would be acting brigade commander. By mid-December, the regiment went into winter quarters, building cabins out of trees available in the area and using what was left to fuel the fires to keep them warm. Hill began to express anti-Northern sentiment as he huddled in his cabin. "What changes, my God, what changes since last we met. Even though we looked forward to this rupture, yet how little idea we had of the reality of things as they now are, and how many of our old friends, upon whom we would have staked our last dime, have shown the cloven foot and are now most bitter in this war of subjugation. Yet nonetheless, by the blessing of God and hearts that will never grow faint, we will whip the hounds yet, and then God grant that a gulf as deep and as wide as hell may interpose between us." He also had doubts about the war itself, stating, "We all are persecuted, and for what? Nothing but to get politicians out of a bad scrape they have talked themselves into." In February 1862, Hill received his long-desired promotion to brigadier general after Joseph E. Johnston recommended him for that rank. He would receive his brigade on March 24th. It consisted of the 1st, 7th, 11th, and 17th Virginia Infantry Regiments, part of James Longstreet's former brigade command. Powell Hill went to meet them at their camps around Orange Courthouse, where he greeted the regiments and attended a cotillion in the town. One soldier remembered that he demonstrated surprising agility on the dance floor. On April 2nd, he and his command received orders to move out to the east of Richmond. Union Army Commander General George McClellan was preparing to invade the Old Dominion from the peninsula made up from the James and York rivers. By the 16th, Hill's brigade arrived at Richmond and embarked on boats down the James River to King's Landing, near the town of Williamsburg. Then the brigade slogged through the mud-caked roads to the Confederate entrenchments around Yorktown. Hill was in the division commanded by James Longstreet, who proved to be a nemesis for Hill throughout the rest of the war. 3 of Longstreet's 4 children had died from scarlet fever earlier in the year. The division commander had become uncommunicative and reserved. Between such a person and the normally genial, outgoing Hill, friction was inevitable. On the peninsula at Wynn's Mill, Hill's men fortified their position until the 1st of May, when Johnston realized his line could not withstand an artillery bombardment, the likes of which McClellan had planned, so the brigade moved westward, past the line of earthworks near Williamsburg. May 5th was a nasty Monday in which a cold downpour limited the visibility and thoroughly drenched everything. It was also the day that Hill got his first taste of battle in the Civil War. Ambrose Powell Hill and his brigade were 3 miles behind the Confederate main entrenchments when Federal forces began to attack the rebel works. As the Blue troops began to gain footholds along the Confederate battle line, the reserves were called forward. Hill's superior, James Longstreet, called for Hill and the brigade to come to the front at once. Dressed in a dark blue blouse, pinched at the waist by his sword, with a sprig of pine attached to his hat, Hill led his men forward toward the sound of battle. When they arrived, they remained behind the front line, strengthening positions there. But around 11 a.m., Longstreet had to do something. If his position got overrun, all of his ammunition and supplies in his divisional wagon train would easily be captured in the muddy roads. He had to buy time. He sent out orders to all of his brigade commanders, Hill included. With bayonets fixed, they pressed through the fields toward a line of trees and thickets. Colonel James Kemper, one of Hill's childhood friends and commander of the 7th Virginia and Hill's brigade, peered through the rain and smoke-filled battlefield, but couldn't identify the troops in his front. He asked Hill who they were. Hill gazed through his field glasses and declared, "Yes, they are Yankees. Give it to them." Dismounted, Hill advanced ahead of his brigade, waving his pistol over his head, looking back over his shoulder and calling on his men to follow. He made a splendid picture of the heroic and gallant soldier that he was. The Virginians pushed back the enemy troops under Joseph Hooker until the enemy retreated to a location of felled trees that gave them great cover. Hill ordered his men to kneel in order to load and fire, and for the next 2 hours, from 45 yards away, the two sides battled, throwing lead into one another's ranks. A private in the brigade wrote, "General Hill came down the line. He stood bolt upright between the contending fires, looked around a while, then went off to the left, returned, looked once more intently into the timber, as if to say this nest must be cleaned out." In those moments, Hill was erect, magnificent, the god of war himself, amid the smoke and the thunder. With the ammunition critically low as evening came on, Hill ordered a charge, which drove the Federals back, but the successful charge had disorganized his lines, and he was forced to pull back in order to regroup. Longstreet would order his division to fall back to the rear after a hard day of fighting. Hill's casualties were 67 killed, 245 wounded, and 14 missing, the highest Confederate brigade loss in the battle. For their losses, they captured 160 Federal soldiers, 7 battle flags, and with the help of the 9th Alabama, 8 pieces of artillery. Hill had fully demonstrated his prowess in battle. He had accepted responsibility, seized the initiative, fought gallantly, and exceeded what was asked of him. On May 15th, Hill and his men moved close to Darbytown as the massive Union Army was making its way up the peninsula. Richmond, the capital of Virginia and the Confederacy itself, was in danger. The call went up to all the states in the Confederacy to help protect the capital, and they began sending troops to Joseph E. Johnston. The influx of troops prompted Johnston to ask Jefferson Davis to allow the creation of more major generals to command all the additional troops streaming into the state. This was allowed, and A.P. Hill was made a major general at the end of May 1862. One of Hill's biographers explained it well when he said, "Hill had entered Confederate service hoping for quick appointment to high command. It had not developed. For 9 months he had gloomily marked time as a colonel, watching chances for glory go to subalterns. Then, in rapid fashion, came brigade command and his first taste of battle. Now the man who wanted to be a general in charge of large numbers of troops, the officer who had led a brigade in but one engagement, found himself at the head of a division. He had jumped from regimental colonel to division major general in precisely 90 days. He would command a large division full of 6 brigades. One of them was commanded by Joseph R. Anderson, a 39-year-old man who had graduated from West Point and was the superintendent of Richmond's Tredegar Iron Works. He would not be with the division long. In 2 months he would leave to oversee ordnance production in Richmond. A brigade of North Carolinians commanded by the Princeton-educated attorney Lawrence Branch was also included in the division. The brigade would go on to achieve great fame in the Army of Northern Virginia and as a part of Hill's division. Hill's South Carolina Brigade, under the colorful lawyer from Columbia, South Carolina, Maxcy Gregg, gave the division commander great joy. Gregg and Hill got along extremely well and was one of the brigade commanders who had free access to Hill. Gregg was an authority on astronomy, and was motivated at the beginning of the war to dedicate himself to secession. He would transform in battle from a more quiet gentleman into a hard-battling warrior. Dorsey Pender was another of Hill's brigadiers. The 28-year-old had a thin frame, an olive complexion, a pointed beard, and a kindly expression, even though it did not match his strict sense of discipline. Hill and Pender got along well. Both were ambitious, intense, and loved combat. Pender could be seen in the thick of combat, astride a horse, enjoying a cigar as he watched his units in battle. Charles W. Field commanded a brigade of Virginians for Hill. Although he was born in Kentucky, his family roots came from Culpeper like Hill. He graduated from West Point 2 years behind his divisional commander. Field was stocky, congenial, and full of humor. The final brigade in Hill's division was a conglomeration of Tennesseans, Alabamians, and Georgians under James Archer. Archer was a Marylander, graduate of Princeton, and had spent time in the regular army, became a successful attorney, and when war broke out, took command of the 5th Texas. Hill's 9 artillery batteries were commanded by Major Reuben Lindsay Walker. Walker descended from a prominent Virginia family, stood 6 feet 4 inches tall, with long hair, a sweeping mustache, an imperial beard, and piercing black eyes that gave a constant grave expression. He would participate in 63 engagements without suffering injury. After the war, whenever someone would ask him if he had been wounded, he would draw himself up and reply, "No, sir, and it was not my fault." On his staff, he had his brother, Baptist, as his major and commissary, a nephew, Francis T. Hill, as his aide-de-camp, and a brother-in-law, Richard C. Morgan, as one of his assistant adjutants general. Another member of his staff was Murray Forbes Taylor, a VMI cadet who Hill had met training soldiers at Harper's Ferry. A volunteer aide to Hill in the later stages of the Peninsula Campaign was John M. Daniel, editor of the Richmond Examiner. One historian described him as tall, with long black locks. His uniform brought back visions of English cavaliers and composed of equal parts cynicism and egotism. It was said he hated the world at large, but loved his few friends with an ardor which shrank at nothing. Few generals in the Civil War were as solicitous of or affectionate toward their men as Hill. In his relations with his brigade and regimental commanders, however, he maintained a polite distance. Hill never referred to any of them by their first name. Embracing a comrade or slapping someone on the back was alien to his nature. Although he did not demand any formality, his presence and aura evoked it, so that with the exception of Gregg and Pender, his officers were strictly formal with him. Hill's division was intended to attack McClellan's right flank at the end of May and early June, but Johnston changed his mind and had Longstreet attack the other flank at the Battle of Seven Pines from May 31st to June 1st. Johnston would be seriously wounded in that engagement. On June 1st, Hill first used a nickname for his new command. At the top of a brief communique he sent to Branch were the words Headquarters, Light Division. The exact origin and intent of the title are unknown. Possibly Hill wanted his men to have a reputation for agility, or the name may have been nothing more than a kind of joke because it was one of the largest divisions in the Confederate armies. One soldier came to the conclusion that the name was applicable, for we often marched without coats, blankets, knapsacks, or any other burdens except our arms and haversacks, which were never heavy and sometimes empty. The morale in the army dipped when Johnston had to be relieved because of his serious wound. Robert E. Lee was named the commanding general of the army. As one historian described, up until that point, most people associated Lee with being a paper shuffler in Richmond, aside from a foray into what is now West Virginia that did not end well for Lee. On June 2nd, Lee met with his generals. Hill and the rest were pleased with the new commander by the time they left the meeting. Hill himself rode back to the Light Division's headquarters, optimistic about the upcoming campaign. Hill's division entrenched the northeast of Richmond, with its left resting on the Richmond, Fredericksburg, and Potomac Railroad. The swamp and horrid sanitation resulted in high percentages of regiments and brigades within the division losing men to typhoid fever and other illnesses. Lee's inspectors went to Hill's entrenchments and gave a great report about its status. They stated, "Hill's defenses are as well advanced as those of any part of the line. His troops are in fine condition. Hill is every inch a soldier and is destined to make his mark." During this time, an exchange of letters passed between Hill and his old friend George McClellan. Powell requested a truce to retrieve the bodies of officers and later asked for a prisoner exchange. McClellan ignored the request, not because he had any disdain for Hill, but because the request had not come from the Army commander, Lee, Hill received a sealed letter requesting all division commanders to meet with Lee the following afternoon. On the day they were to meet, Major General Daniel Harvey Hill arrived at Lee's headquarters first, standing outside the building. He spied a figure riding toward him. He saw that it was his brother-in-law, Thomas Stonewall Jackson, riding an incredible 52 miles in 14 hours to make it to Lee. His troops had just waged a successful campaign in the Shenandoah Valley and astounded everyone with his presence at the meeting simply because they thought him still too far away at the time. A.P. Hill and Longstreet arrived together. Hill saw Jackson and remembered him as his antithesis at West Point. Lee welcomed all of his commanders into his headquarters and shut the door. This was the first time in the war that the 5 generals had been together. The men surrounding Lee were all bearded. Their uniforms were blanketed with dust. Longstreet was the oldest at 43, D.H. Hill was 40, Jackson 38, and Powell Hill was the youngest at 37. The meeting lasted for 4 hours, and Lee laid out his plan for his left to attack McClellan's right flank. Powell Hill was to force his way across the Mechanicsville Bridge, linking up with Jackson once across. D.H. Hill and Longstreet would move across and support Hill and Jackson in the attack. Jackson picked the date of the attack since his troops still had to come from the valley. He said June 25th, but Longstreet declared the timetable too close, and Lee agreed. Jackson then stated that his troops would be in position by the morning of June 26th. It was agreed. Powell Hill did not speak much in this meeting. He was the junior officer and the new division commander, so he mostly listened. On the 26th, Hill sat in the saddle at the head of 6 brigades of infantry and 9 batteries of artillery, about 14,000 men, wearing a red calico shirt, which the men would begin to call his battle shirt. The black felt hat slouched forward, and his sword dangled at his side. Hill's attack relied on Jackson's movements, but Jackson was late. Hill figured that Jackson would be in position by no later than 8 a.m., but it was now 3 p.m. Powell was nervous and agitated at the lack of communication. He took a risk and ordered his men across the Chickahominy. Field's Virginians were in the lead. They sent back the Federal pickets and poured a volley into the abandoned camps. Pots, pans, and tent poles were the only casualties from that volley, but they pressed on to the town of Mechanicsville. When Longstreet and D.H. Hill heard the sounds of battle from Powell's engagement with the Federals around Mechanicsville, they assumed that Jackson and Powell had began their flanking movement and moved across the Chickahominy. Lee accompanied both D.H. Hill and Longstreet. When Lee arrived at Mechanicsville, he learned for the first time that Hill had attacked without Jackson. Lee had no choice. He couldn't disengage now that Hill was attacking, and presumably Jackson would be attacking soon. Once through the town of Mechanicsville, Hill kept up the momentum and pushed eastward, toward the entrenchments of Fitz-John Porter and his 30,000 Federal infantry. Hill sent his massed infantry against well-entrenched infantry and superior artillery. Although one Confederate brigade broke through the Union line, there was no support to capitalize on it. When darkness covered the battlefield, Hill's men slept on the ground where they stopped fighting. The next morning at 8 a.m., Hill sent the brigade of Maxcy Gregg as the lead unit, since they had not engaged the day before. As they pressed over Beaver Dam Creek, artillery killed 2 men on their left, but the artillery was from Jackson's Valley Army on Hill's left, who again were late in attacking. Hill sent word to Jackson about the friendly fire, and then Hill himself met with Jackson. A short time later, another rider approached the 2 generals. It was Lee. All 3 men dismounted and discussed what to do next. Lee's plan had been altered because Jackson was late again. The Union line had moved to Gaines' Mill. Lee instructed Jackson to swing around the right flank of the Union entrenchments, while Hill hit their center and Longstreet would form on Hill's right. Together, Lee believed, they could break through the fortifications. Hill was the first to arrive in position again. He would not throw his brigades in one at a time like before. Now he would throw the entire weight of the light division against the enemy. 1 p.m. was the time designated for the attack, but Longstreet was not on his right and Jackson was not on his left. Hill could see Union troops strengthening the position in his front. If he didn't move soon, it may be too strong to break. It was now 2:30 p.m., and Hill ordered his brigades in without support. But time was a critical factor. The enemy must be met before the enemy reinforcements could come up. The attack was a slaughter. For the second day in a row, Hill's division was fighting in a death trap at the bottom of a watery ravine. Gregg's brigade was able to pierce the Union line. My men, although now under 3 crossfires and fallen thick and fast from one end of the line to the other, never once faltered, some of the men having it hand to hand, clubbing their rifles, then dispatching 4 or 5 with the bayonet. Another soldier noted, "There was no cheering, every man was fighting with his mouth closed and standing his ground with all the courage he could command, and never anywhere do I recall a heavier fire than on the left of our line. General A.P. Hill, that magnificent fighter, showing himself the man he always was." The infantry made repeated assaults but could never gain a permanent breakthrough. The artillery dueled back and forth, with one cannon of the PD artillery firing 239 rounds, and became so heated that the barrel bent at the trunnions and the cannon had to be abandoned. Federals began to swarm over Hill's flanks, since neither Longstreet nor Jackson were giving him any support. He ordered his attacks to stop and for the men to lie down where they were. These brave men had done all that any soldiers could do. From having been the attacking, I now became the attacked, but stubbornly, gallantly, was the ground held. After nearly 3 hours of slaughter, Jackson was finally falling in on Hill's left. Longstreet was coming up as well, but the Light Division could do little more than follow the stronger front line. Lee and Hill rode to the rear of the gigantic attack. As they rode by a tree, they saw a frightened captain hiding behind it. One of Lee's aides described what happened next. General Hill leaped from his horse in fierce anger, denounced the coward, took his sword from him, and attempted to break it over his knee. The sword was of as bad metal as the man who wore it, and bent instead of breaking. General Hill hurled it as far as he could, remounted his horse, and rode on into the charge. The stubborn Federal line broke under the weight of Lee's army, severing the Union Army's ties with the York River Railroad, as well as with the York and Pamunkey Rivers. Even Longstreet gave credit to Hill for his actions during the engagement. The Confederate commanders, except A.P. Hill, claimed credit for the first breach in General Porter's lines. The troops of the gallant A.P. Hill that did as much and effective fighting as any received little of the credit properly due them. It was their long and steady fight that thinned the Federal ranks and caused them to so foul their guns that they were out of order when the final struggle came. Hill's hard-hitting tactics and relentless pursuit of victory had gained Lee's eye as well as the praise of the South. Robert E. Lee wanted to keep the Union off balance and planned to pinch the enemy forces between his wings and deliver a devastating blow to the Union center. A.P. Hill and James Longstreet were placed in the center, with Stonewall Jackson on their left and John B. Magruder on their right. Artillery discharges could be heard from the direction of White Oak Swamp, meaning that Jackson was engaged, so it was now time to move Hill and Longstreet into battle at Frazier's Farm. Longstreet moved in first. President Jefferson Davis came out of the Capitol to view the engagement. He and Lee were in the rear of Hill's lines when artillery rounds came uncomfortably close to the two men. Hill rode up to the President and the Commanding General and said, "This is no place for either of you, and as commander of this part of the field, I'll order you both to the rear." Davis chuckled, saying, "We will obey your orders," and then both men moved a short distance to the rear. The artillery grew more intense, and Hill again rode up to Davis and Lee, saying, "Did I not tell you to go away from here? And did you not promise to obey my orders? Why, one shell from that battery over yonder may presently deprive the Confederacy of its president and the Army of Northern Virginia of its commander." This time Davis and Lee gave more heed to the young general and retired from the field. With Magruder not coming up on his right and Jackson failing to come up on his left, Longstreet decided to hopefully break through the Union line with himself and Hill in support. The day was passing by and the large attack needed to be ordered immediately. The men moved out and Hill was among the men, leading and cheering them on in his quiet and determined manner. He saw the overwhelming numbers with which they had to contend, but calmly planning his designs, he was fiery in the execution of them, giving counsel as if in private life, but reining his horse and dashing to the front whenever his battalions began to swerve before the masses of the enemy. Union General George McCall was taken prisoner when he accidentally rode into Confederate lines in the twilight of the day. With numerous rebel rifled muskets aimed at him, he begged the commander of the 47th Virginia to not let the Virginians harm him. He would be shuffled off to a Richmond prison. In the desperate attacks, Hill urged his men on until tears welled up in his eyes, pleading with every man to keep pushing forward. They broke up many of the Federals in their front, and when night came, the men slept where they had stopped fighting. The trap that Lee had laid did not materialize. Magruder did little to hit the Union flank, and Jackson did not force his way across White Oak Swamp. But something did come out of this horrible slaughter. Hill gained great respect from Lee. Hill and Longstreet had demonstrated unusually good coordination in a two-division attack across broken country. A Mississippi soldier proclaimed Hill a general of genius because had it not been for the scientific handling of his men, few would have slept uninjured on the torn and bloody field on Monday night. Frazier's Farm will prove the never-fading honor of Hill if the impetuous spirit of that gallant soldier does not meet with an untimely fate. Longstreet wrote, "Major General A.P. Hill deserves credit for the condition of his new troops and the promptness and energy displayed in throwing his forces forward at the proper time and to the proper points." Confusion and tardiness led to Hill's division taking heavy casualties in repeated battles, but had resulted in gaining great fame. Despite the problems within the Army, Lee planned for another attack. Lee met with Longstreet, Jackson, and both Hills at Willis Church to discuss the upcoming engagement. The Army commander determined to attack Malvern Hill, but A.P. Hill and Longstreet would remain in reserve, giving their troops much-needed rest. Although a few shells were lobbed in amongst them, they saw no major action. After that, Hill's division encamped on the south side of Richmond and recovered from the hard campaign. Although he had attacked before properly being supported at Mechanicsville, Lee, in his official report, glossed over that and decided to praise him for his courageous assaults. The Army commander used an adjective that future writers often applied to Hill. Hill, he stated, advanced into battle with the impetuous courage for which that officer and his troops are distinguished. Impetuous Hill was at Mechanicsville, and less so at Gaines' Mill and Frazier's Farm. He had promptly executed movements effectively, rushed once into an attack without proper caution, and always fought hard. On the peninsula, he showed that hesitation was not in his makeup. He was a fighter who would slam into whatever loomed in his path. In truth, Hill needed seasoning. His temperament required more control. However, he clearly emerged from the Peninsula Campaign with the reputation of being one of the best combat officers Lee had. During the lull, Dolly with the children joined her husband in Richmond, and although it should have been a pleasant time for Hill, this early part of July brought about a collision between Hill and Longstreet, and its effects would have reverberations throughout the war. John M. Daniel, the editor of the Richmond Examiner, who had attached himself to Hill's staff in May, was wounded at Gaines' Mill and came back to Richmond to continue his work at the newspaper. Daniel admired Hill and had become great friends with him. When Daniel recounted the 7 Days battle, he uplifted Hill beyond his actual accomplishments, especially when he discussed the Battle of Frazier's Farm, where he insisted that Hill was the overall commander of both his and Longstreet's divisions. That was false. Daniel wrote, "The battle was fought under the immediate and sole command of General A.P. Hill in charge of both divisions. The heroic command of General Hill pressed on with unquailing vigor and a resistless courage, driving the enemy before them. One fact is very certain, and that is that the Battle of Monday night was fought exclusively by General A.P. Hill and forces under his command." Longstreet, upset about the dismissal of his role in the engagements, wrote a scathing rebuttal and asked his chief of staff, Moxley Sorrell, to sign and mail it. Sorrell was mad as well with the newspaper's misrepresentation, and mailed it to the Examiner's competitor, the Richmond Whig. It stated in part, "No one in the Army has any objects to Major General A.P. Hill being supplied with all the notoriety that the Examiner can furnish, provided no great injustice is done to the others. The 8,000 claimed to have been lost by General A.P. Hill's division alone will cover the loss of the entire Army during the week's campaign." Exaggerated statements of casualties like these made by the Examiner are calculated to be of great injury to the Army, both at home and abroad. To Hill, this seemed an attack on the division and its role in the battles, and feeling his own honor being attacked, wrote to Lee to be relieved from the command of Longstreet. Longstreet endorsed the letter and the request. However, when Longstreet asked for a routine report from Hill, Hill refused to acknowledge any communication with Longstreet. After attempting several times to communicate with Hill, Longstreet had Moxley Sorrell place Hill under arrest. Hill stood erect as Sorrell came into his tent, heard the news, and remained standing as Sorrell left. Anderson would assume temporary command of the Light Division. Each general exchanged scathing letters with one another until Hill challenged Longstreet to a duel. Arrangements were being made to conduct the duel when Lee stepped in. What was said by Lee is unknown, but through other friends matters were settled so that both men maintained their honor. However, Hill and Longstreet would conduct themselves in what one historian described as coldly courteous when they did communicate. McClellan was headed back down the peninsula, but Robert E. Lee and the Army of Northern Virginia had a threat to their north. Union General John Pope and his army were threatening Northern Virginia. Lee had already sent Jackson to Gordonsville to keep an eye on Pope, but with 50,000 Union soldiers, Jackson was outmatched. A.P. Hill sat at headquarters arrested, but Lee needed a dependable division commander to send to Jackson's aid. Longstreet was the ranking Major General, but he was needed around Richmond. The matter was settled. Hill would be released, and he with his 10,000-man division would join Jackson at Gordonsville. Lee sent a letter to Jackson with a directive. A.P. Hill, you will find, I think, a good officer with whom you can consult, and by advising with your division commanders as to your movements, much trouble will be saved you in arranging details as they can act more intelligently. In this impeccably courteous way, Lee was telling Jackson that Hill was a team man, but sensitive to military protocol and etiquette, and that Jackson should keep Hill and all his generals regularly informed as to what he was doing, which was against Jackson's nature. The division began departing Richmond on July 27th by rail to Gordonsville. Hill would leave 3 days later with the last of his division, with Dolly, Nettie, and Russie in tow. The war had brought husband and wife closer together. With no family in Virginia, Dolly insisted on being by her husband's side, even in the field. Despite some snide comments about her presence in the army, Dolly seemed to pay them no mind and enjoyed her time with her husband. In early August, news reached Jackson that at least 2 Federal divisions were moving toward Culpeper, so the Confederate general started moving his columns in that direction. But Jackson was quiet about any intention. Hill marched his columns as directed by Jackson, but he did not know the final destination. Captain Charles Blackford of the 2nd Virginia Cavalry asked Hill, his old friend, where they were going. Hill replied, "I suppose we will go to the top of the hill in the front of us. That is all I know." The lack of information was irritating Hill, and when the marching orders came for August 8th, Jackson ordered Richard Ewell's division to lead the advance, followed by Hill, and then Charles Winder's division would bring up the rear. However, during the night before the march, Jackson had changed his mind. Ewell would march by an alternate route to the west, but Hill was not made aware of that change. So, in the morning, Hill had his men ready before dawn, but there was no Ewell. The minutes ticked by, and Hill became agitated. He said to one of his longtime friends, "I tell you, I do not know whether we march north, south, east, or west, or whether we will march at all. General Jackson simply ordered me to have the division ready to move at dawn. I have been ready ever since, and have no further indication of his plans. That is almost all I ever know of his designs." Then columns of troops began marching past him. These weren't Ewell's men, they were Winder's. Not wanting to create a traffic jam by interrupting Winder's march, he allowed them to go by, then started his march. Jackson arrived irate and asked why Hill's division had not started to move. Hill explained himself and Stonewall rode off, still mad at the situation. Ewell and Winder collided when the roads they were marching on converged. The advance Jackson had planned was falling apart. He sent word back to Hill to reverse the course and go back to Gordonsville, which Hill did, but Jackson would claim he never gave that order. Jackson blamed Hill for the orders gone awry, and Hill would hold contempt for Jackson, knowing full well Jackson had not given the orders. The next day, Hill was to catch up to the main body of troops marching to Culpeper, but he had a longer distance to march. South of Culpeper, at Cedar Mountain, Jackson ran into a Union force under Nathaniel Banks. The 2 Confederate divisions under Jackson were thrown into battle, but were starting to give way. Even Jackson's old division was falling apart, and as one officer said, turned into a mob. Blackford was sent by Jackson to look for Hill. To his relief, he saw Hill at the head of his division. Powell had heard the sounds of battle and rushed his men forward. The light division braced the middle of the Confederate line, and the rest formed on its left, just in the nick of time. As he led his men forward, Confederate infantrymen were streaming back through his battle lines. He spied an able-bodied officer half running to the rear. Hill reined his horse and asked the man, who was he and where was he going? The man replied that he was accompanying his wounded friend to the rear. Hill bent down and ripped the officer's rank off of his collar, and looking him coldly in the eyes said, You are a pretty fellow to hold a commission, deserting your colors in the presence of the enemy, and go into the rear with a man who is scarcely badly enough wounded to go himself. I reduce you to the ranks, sir, and if you do not go to the front and do your duty, I'll have you shot as soon as I can spare a file of men for the purpose." Hill's men halted and threw back the Union assaults, and when the Federals began to flee, Hill's division chased after them for miles. With the possible threat of Union reinforcements, Jackson ordered the Light Division back to the battlefield. Jackson had won a victory, to be sure, but Hill had won the battle for him. On the battlefield, Hill found a gray stallion that he would name Champ and ride him exclusively afterward. Lee and Longstreet would join Jackson, and the commanding general would formulate a plan to eliminate Pope's army. Longstreet would hold Pope in front, while Jackson marched his troops to the northwest, then curl around to strike the flank of Pope's army. According to Lee's directive, Hill was to take the lead and march at dawn. At the last moment, Jackson ordered the march to begin, in his words, "as soon as the moon shall rise." But none of his division commanders received those orders. When Jackson rode to where the divisions were to pass by, no soldiers came. Furious, Jackson rode to Hill's encampment and asked why he was not moving out. Hill replied that he hadn't received any order to move out during the night, and he hadn't. Jackson ordered the division to move, and it did. The march was hindered by rain, and this brought the march to a stop. Hill and his staff found a home to use as headquarters, as did Jackson and his staff. Next to Jackson's headquarters, Gregg's South Carolina Brigade bivouacked for the night in the rain. Jackson ordered the family's ornamental fence to not be touched or used as firewood. However, the South Carolinians used it as firewood to help dry themselves out and cook some food. The next morning, Jackson had all of Gregg's regimental colonels arrested for the act. Bad blood was brewing between Jackson and the Light Division. The next morning, Jackson found that the flimsy dam that Jubal Early's division had used to get across the Rappahannock had been consumed by the flood river from the heavy rain. Stonewall rode out into the middle of the river and sat there for an hour. Hill attempted to break the silence and rode out to him, but Jackson was so rude that Hill came back to the banks of the river without orders or instructions. Lee's plan had been foiled by a rainstorm. However, Lee would formulate a new plan. Jackson swung up the valley created by the Blue Ridge and the Bull Mountains and through Thoroughfare Gap. At that gap, Jackson held a rare council of war. After hearing from his division commanders, Jackson said he would give his decision for marching in the morning. Hill, who had always been critical of Stonewall's deep piety, turned to Ewell and said, "Well, I suppose Jackson wants time to pray over it." Jackson divided his three divisions into a three-pronged march to get in the rear of Pope's army. By the end, they had covered 54 miles in 36 hours. Jackson had effected one of the great flanking movements of the war. He was behind Pope's army and only 27 miles from the northern capital. On the other hand, Jackson had barely 24,000 men. Pope could congregate 80,000 or so Federals, and the rest of Lee's army was a good distance away. Jackson's command made it to Manassas Junction, where the men were delighted to find boxcar after boxcar full of Union Army provisions. A Virginia soldier recalled the scene. It was more than funny to see the ragged, rough, dirty fellows who had been half living on roasted corn and green apples for days, now drinking Rhine wine, eating lobster salad, potted tongue, cream biscuit, pound cake, canned fruits, and the like, the filling pockets and haversacks with ground coffee, toothbrushes, condensed milk, and silk handkerchiefs. A South Carolinian noted that fine whiskey and cigars circulated freely. Elegant lawn and linen handkerchiefs were applied to noses hitherto blown by the thumb or forefinger, and sumptuous underclothing was fitted over limbs sunburnt, sore, and vermin-splotched. Jackson then moved his troops to Groveton, with Hill's division going to Centerville, the opposite direction. Word came to Stonewall that Pope was retreating to Washington, and he ordered Hill to blockade the routes to stop the enemy army. Hill got different reports that Pope was moving to Manassas Junction to attack Jackson. Hill had the correct information and disobeyed Jackson's order by coming to Groveton on part of the Manassas battlefield fought the year before. On their way there, Hill's troops stopped at a farm that had a well. They were very thirsty and began bringing up pail after pail of water to fill their stomachs and canteens. Soon the farmer came out of the house and said, "I don't think that water's very good. When the battle was fought here last summer, some dead men were thrown into it, and it has not been cleaned out since." A North Carolina soldier noted, "You can imagine that those canteens were soon emptied, and some of the men also." Hill filed into line with the rest of Jackson's divisions. The fact that Jackson did not chastise Hill for not following orders indicates that Jackson knew he had been wrong about Pope's retreat. On August 28, 1862, late in the day, a small battle at Groveton, also known as Bronner's Farm, took place between Jackson's force and a small Union contingent. Hill directed the first artillery volley that played havoc with the Union forces. It was a short but deadly engagement. It dealt a crippling blow to Jackson's high-level command. Tolliver, who had taken over from Winder, who had been killed at Cedar Mountain, was badly wounded and would not rejoin the command for a few months, and Ewell would receive a serious wound that resulted in him losing his leg. That left Hill as the only experienced division commander Jackson had. Stonewall would depend on Hill over the next 2 days, as Bull Run would see another major battle. On August 29th, Hill displayed his tenaciousness in battle. When John Pope's Union Army moved against Stonewall Jackson's line, A.P. Hill's Light Division constituted the left wing of Jackson's line. Gregg's South Carolinians were on the extreme left, Thomas was in the center, and Field was on the right of Hill's line. Generals Archer, Pender, and Branch were placed in the rear of the main line. The Union brigades that hurled themselves against the Confederate line concentrated on Hill's division, attempting to outflank Gregg's men. Hill closely monitored the situation, always near the front of his lines, helping to ease the fears of his men by making his presence known in the toughest of fights. Near disaster struck Hill's line when the mostly New England brigade of Brigadier General Grover broke through Thomas's Georgians. Hill immediately went to the breakthrough. He was on foot, organizing troops to push back Grover's men. Amid the chaos, Hill thought of Gregg and the pressure on the left and sent a staff officer to see how the South Carolinian was doing. Gregg said, "Tell him that our ammunition is exhausted, but rocks are plentiful, and we will hold our position with them until we can get ammunition." It took nearly an hour for Hill to push back Grover's men, but with the help of Dorsey Pender's brigade, Grover's brigade was thrown back. Hill dashed off again, this time to Gregg's line personally. He yelled to his troops, "Good for you boys, give them the rocks and the bayonets, and hold your position, and I will soon have ammunition and reinforcements for you." The day was getting late, and Jackson sent one of his staff to Hill to get a report. Hill told him that most of his men were out of ammunition. The Federals could be seen massing, possibly for another assault, and that he was hard-pressed. When Jackson heard the news, his face grew dark and said to the staff officer, "Tell him if they attack, he must beat them." The staffer barely left Stonewall's presence before the general rode after him and accompanied him to meet with Hill. In a more softer tone than he had conveyed to the staff officer, he explained to Hill that he must throw back any attack that may come. About that time, a volley of musketry erupted from the front of Hill's line. "Here it comes," Hill shouted. As the division commander rode off, Jackson yelled, "I'll expect you to beat them." A member of Archer's brigade painted a vivid picture of the situation. 3 lines of battle, one after the other, in beautiful order, with banners flying, hurled themselves against our men in the cut. The front line was nearly annihilated, but the second came to the rescue and nearly met the same fate. Such a contest with rocks and butt ends of muskets I have never seen or read of before or since. The maddened men, the flying stones, the clubbed muskets, the shouts, yells, smoke, dust, din, and rattle of that scene passes description. It was a slaughter, but Hill had thrown back a horrible assault on his line. A member of Hill's staff rode to Jackson and reported that the Union attack had failed and Hill's lines were still intact. A rare smile crept over Jackson's face and he said, "Tell him I knew he would do it." The next day, August 30th, Pope attacked Jackson's lines again, thinking him in retreat. What Pope did not know was that Jackson was not retreating and that Longstreet had arrived on the field the night before. When Pope attacked Jackson's lines once again, Hill defended his position admirably as Longstreet launched a major assault against Pope's troops, catching the Union soldiers off guard. When the Yankee soldiers began to skedaddle, Hill ordered his light division to pursue them, and did so into the night. It was a great victory. One of Hill's biographers put it best when he said, "Second Manassas was his first major defensive action. He incurred his highest losses of the war simply because he was the chief target of 2 days of Union assaults." He did not allow the heat of battle or enemy breakthroughs to cloud his thinking or shake his confidence. The manner in which he rushed troops to the right place at the right time was a masterly display of coordination. He drove his men hard and demanded much. Victory was the result. Even the usually restrained Jackson wrote glowingly in his official report, "Assault after assault was made on the left, exhibiting on the part of the enemy great pertinacity and determination, but every advance was met most successfully and gallantly driven back." A moment during the battle that shows the complexity of Hill as a human being was when a Massachusetts surgeon was captured during the engagement. The surgeon, while in Confederate custody, began tending to wounded Union and Confederate. When Hill found this out, he gave him all the rights and privileges of a non-combatant and allowed the gentleman to leisurely pass through the Confederate camp without a guard, until a few days after the battle, Hill helped secure the surgeon safe passage into Union lines. Jackson and Hill would pursue the retreating enemy, and on September 1st, Jackson would engage the troops of Philip Kearny and Isaac Stevens. A torrent of rain slowed down the attacks, but the battle still raged. Hill reported to Jackson that his ammunition was wet. Jackson replied, "Give my compliments to General Hill and tell him that the Yankee ammunition is as wet as his, to stay where he is." The battle continued until dark covered the battlefield, leaving 2 Union generals dead, Kearny and Stevens. Hill rode to a cabin alongside the road. Kearny's body laid on the porch. Hill had knew Kearny before the war, and when he saw the body he said, "Poor Kearny, he deserved a better death than that." Robert E. Lee formulated his plan to invade Maryland, and as the Army of Northern Virginia was beginning its march toward the U.S. border, Hill and Jackson began to butt heads. Jackson met with his division commanders on September 3rd at sundown. He wanted the march to begin at 4 a.m. and had all his division commanders set their watches by his. Hill's men would be in the lead. Jackson rode to where the men would be passing by, but no troops were marching. Irritated, he rode over to Gregg's brigade, who had not even broke camp, and asked why he was not marching. Gregg told him that the men were filling their canteens before the march began. At that moment, Hill rode up. Jackson reprimanded him, and the columns began their march. Hill picked up the pace to keep Jackson from complaining about slowness, but this led to heavy straggling. At noon, the columns were supposed to stop for a rest by Jackson's orders. Hill kept the men moving. Jackson was furious and rode to the lead column and ordered them to halt. The rest period passed, and Jackson ordered them to resume the march. Hill, discovering the break in marching, inquired as to why his troops had halted without orders. General Thomas said that Jackson had ordered him to do so. This was the last straw for Hill. He dismounted and stomped up to Jackson. Stonewall had broke military protocol by directly dealing with Hill's subordinates without going through the proper chain of command. He said, "If you take command of my troops in my presence, take my sword also." Jackson told him to put it away, but to consider himself under arrest. Branch was placed in command of the Light Division, and Hill was relegated to marching behind his column of troops on foot. For the second time in 2 months, Hill had been put under arrest, and this time it was on the eve of one of the most dramatic and daring campaigns for the Army of Northern Virginia. On September 5th, a North Carolina lieutenant recounted Hill's situation on the Maryland campaign. General Hill marched on foot with the rear guard all day through Maryland, an old white hat slouched down over his eyes, his coat off, and wearing an old flannel shirt, looking as mad as a bull. After a multi-day stay in Maryland, Lee became worried about the Union garrison at Harper's Ferry. It had not retreated into Maryland when he began the invasion like he had hoped. He would send Jackson with the Light Division in tow to capture the garrison that laid along his route of retreat and entrance to the Shenandoah Valley. Hill rode in an ambulance behind his division, suffering from a bout of prostatitis. However, when he sensed that an engagement was developing, he told one of Jackson's staff, "I do not want anyone else commanding my division in an engagement." He wanted the staffer to ask Stonewall if he could be placed back in command of his troops until the campaign was over, and that he would go back under arrest afterward. The staffer relayed the information to Jackson, who agreed that he needed his most experienced division commander in the event of an engagement and gave Hill back command of the Light Division. Donning his coat and sword, he mounted his horse and dashed off to the front of his troops, and looking like a young eagle in search of his prey, he took command of his division to the delight of all his men. He crossed the Potomac River at Light's Ford and then proceeded to Martinsburg, capturing it after the Union troops there evacuated, then proceeded to Harper's Ferry. Jackson and Hill knew the location well and knew the disadvantages posed by the heights around the town. Jackson chose Hill to play an integral role in capturing the garrison. Hill strategically placed his men on the heights as the other divisions created a diversion. With artillery pieces aimed at the garrison, it was now just a matter of time before the blue troops surrendered. During the morning of September 15th, as Hill in his shirt sleeves prepared his men for an attack, he came across General Gregg and one of Gregg's colonels, who was under arrest by Jackson, in a deep discussion. The colonel wanted to be allowed into the ranks as a private to fight. Hill was told of the situation and told Gregg to give the colonel his sword back. One of the gunners wrote poetically about the artillery perched atop the heights. The great circle of artillery opened, all fire into a common center, while the clouds of smoke rolled up from the tops of the various mountains, and the thunder of the guns reverberating among them gave the idea of so many volcanoes. Jackson and Hill watched the destruction together. When the counterfire from the Federal artillery slacked, Jackson turned to Hill and said, "General Hill, charge and give them the bayonet." Hill nodded, turned his horse, and raised his hand to a bugler nearby, and a combination of artillery and the threat of Confederate infantry resulted in the garrison's capitulation. General Julius White rode into Hill's lines to formally surrender. One of Hill's biographers described the scene. The party reached the crest of a hill on the Charlestown Turnpike when Hill galloped up from his command. In contrast to White, who was immaculately dressed, the coatless Hill resembled a farmer who had just completed his plowing. White expressed praise for the skill and energy exhibited by the Confederates in the investment of Harper's Ferry. Hill replied courteously, "I would rather take the place 20 times than undertake to hold it once." They then proceeded to a schoolhouse that Jackson was using as a temporary headquarters. Jackson told White, "The surrender must be unconditional, General. Every indulgence can be granted afterward." Jackson then directed Hill to draw up the surrender terms. Officers and men were to be paroled and would not serve again in the Union Army until officially exchanged. The officers could retain sidearms and private baggage. All captured Federals could keep blankets and overcoats and would be supplied with 2 days' rations before departure. Hill even loaded 27 wagons for carrying excess baggage. He would later complain strongly that the Yankees were inexcusably slow in returning the borrowed wagons. The surrender resulted in the capture of 12,000 prisoners, 13,000 stand of arms, 73 pieces of artillery, 200 wagons, and incalculable stores of supplies. The brief battle resulted in 3 men killed and 66 wounded in Hill's division. Hill's men quickly put on parts of Union uniforms, since theirs had become worn out, and traded in their worn out or outdated firearms for brand new Springfield rifled muskets. It was Hill's division that was chosen to parole the prisoners, and Jackson allowed Hill's men to stay behind while the rest marched to meet Lee in Maryland. Before General White had marched to Harper's Ferry with his Union troops, Colonel Dixon Miles commanded the garrison's forces, but had been mortally wounded by an artillery shell after deciding to surrender. Miles and Hill had known each other before the war, and as Miles lay dying, sent messages to his household through Hill and asked that his sword should be sent to his wife. While Hill was attending to parolees in the upstairs of one of the armory buildings, a man with a Federal cavalry uniform came in. The man stated that he was a non-combatant and would like a pass to return home. Hill got up out of his seat, called him a liar, grabbed him by the shoulders, walked him to the door, and kicked him down the stairs. To the north, Lee had moved his troops closer to Jackson's position as the large Army of the Potomac, under Hill's friend George McClellan, lumbered toward the outnumbered Confederates. Lee realized he needed every man possible and sent a courier to Hill to come to Sharpsburg. The courier arrived at 6:30 a.m. on September 17th. In half an hour, the first of Hill's brigades were marching out of Harper's Ferry. Only Thomas's Georgians were left behind to guard the town. Hill did not take the direct 12-mile route from Harper's Ferry to Sharpsburg, but took a 17-mile course that carried the troops somewhat westward and over the Potomac at Shepherdstown. He never explained why he took the longer route, but it is most likely he thought that the direct route may put him in contact with Federals before he reached Lee. With the exception of 2, possibly 3 times when the winding column halted just long enough to get their breath, Hill kept his men moving at a killing pace. He was wearing a brand new red flannel shirt that he had picked up in Harper's Ferry from the Federal quartermaster stores, and he urged his men along the way that they must press on, that General Lee needed them. If men began lagging behind, he prodded them with his sword. At Bottlers Ford, the men raised their rifled muskets, cartridge boxes, and cap boxes over their heads to cross the Potomac. Hill watered his horse at the river, and as he did so, coatless, with no rank or insignia, the wagon train began to pass. One of the teamsters began cursing and beating the animals who only wanted to stop to get themselves a drink. Hill shouted at the man to stop mistreating the animals. The teamster told the plainly dressed horseman to mind his own business and went back to cursing. The next thing the teamster felt was the flat end of Hill's sword across his back. He did not have to be told thereafter who his division commander was. Hill could hear the roar of battle from a great distance and rode ahead to inform Lee that his men would be up momentarily. The situation was dire for Lee's army. Ambrose Burnside's corps had got across Antietam Creek and was threatening to cave in Lee's right flank. The flank had already been pushed back, but if Burnside went further, he could cut off the Confederate line of retreat. At just that critical moment, Hill himself could be seen. It was 2:30 p.m., and the Light Division had marched an incredible 17 miles in 7 hours. Lee forgot military decorum and embraced Hill. Lee instructed him to throw his men to the right of David R. Jones's small division. General Archer was suffering from illness and had to be carried to the battle in an ambulance, but once on the field, his staff helped him mount his horse with a high fever, and he directed his Tennesseans and Alabamians in the battle. At one point, Hill spotted an officer hiding behind a tree. As usual, he berated the coward, demanded the man's sword, and broke it over the officer's shoulder. Another soldier was seen cowering, unable to move further out of fear. When Hill approached him, the young man murmured, "I can't stand it, General. I haven't the courage." Hill replied in a calm voice to the young man, "Go to the rear then, before you cause good men to run." Much of the fighting Hill's men did was in and around a cornfield. At some points, the two sides were less than 30 yards away. Lawrence Branch was meeting with both Generals Gregg and Archer when a bullet tore through his right cheek and came out the back of his head. The dead general slumped silently to the ground. The death was hard on Hill. He stated that he was my senior brigadier and one to whom I could have entrusted the command of the division with all confidence. The whole repulse took about an hour, but Hill had saved Lee's right flank from being destroyed. The Light Division suffered 64 killed, 304 wounded, and 6 missing. During the night of September 17th, a major asked Hill if he knew Burnside, who his men had repulsed. "Ought to," Hill snorted. "He owes me $8,000. Burnside had borrowed that sum several years earlier from his West Point friend, and the debt remained unpaid. The Light Division had won itself great fame since its inception just a few months earlier, but it had been a hard-fought reputation. Brigadier General Dorsey Pender wrote to his wife that, "You have no idea what a reputation our division has. It surpasses Jackson's division both for fighting and discipline. But when I tell you that this division has lost 9,000 killed and wounded since we commenced the Richmond fight at Mechanicsville, you can see what our reputation has cost us." The 6 brigades of the Light Division numbered barely 4,700 men. Once Hill and the Army of Northern Virginia made it back into Virginia, Hill resumed his feud with Jackson. Hill asked that a court of inquiry be supplied to investigate the charge of neglect of duty. Robert E. Lee was in a difficult situation. Jackson's authority had to be respected, but he needed one of his best fighting generals in Hill. He would write, Hill's attention being now called to what appeared to be a neglect of duty by his commander, but which from an officer of his character could not be intentional, and I feel assured will never be repeated. I see no advantage to the service in further investigating this matter, nor could it, without detriment, be done at this time. Hill took Lee's comment as a judgment call by Lee that he had agreed with Jackson's charge, so he wrote to Lee, "I deny the truth of every allegation made by Major General Jackson, and am prepared to prove my denial by a number of honorable men. If General Jackson had accorded me the courtesy of asking an explanation of each instance of neglect of duty as it occurred, I think that even he would have been satisfied and the necessity avoided of keeping a black list against me. Jackson is the officer who abuses his authority to punish and then sustains his punishment by making loose charges against an officer who had done and is doing his utmost to make his troops efficient. Jackson was willing to drop the matter, but sent Lee the charges to begin a court of inquiry. Lee saw that the situation was now getting out of hand and called the 2 men to Jackson's headquarters. By talking with both men together, Lee was able to smooth over but not extinguish the quarrel. From then on, Jackson and Hill would keep their communication formal and seldom. Also after Antietam, Lee was reorganizing the army. He would divide his army into 2 corps, one headed by Longstreet and the other headed by Jackson. Within his letter describing his decision to President Davis, he mentioned that Hill was the third best officer that he had in the Army, and if a third corps was to be created, Hill would receive command of it, demonstrating how much faith and trust he had in Hill. During the fall encampment in Northern Virginia, the Army and Hill's Light Division recuperated. An infestation of lice and fleas forced Hill to order whole companies to march into the Opequon River to hopefully drown the pest and bring relief to the soldiers. During this time, the division regrouped. It ended Antietam with 4,700 men, but by the end of October, the force was back up to 9,400 through men returning to the ranks from minor wounds and recruitment bringing in new troops to the ranks. With the feud with Jackson calmed, Hill settled into the quiet encampment with his children and wife by his side, the 3 girls he called them. His men presented him with a bronze-colored pipe, carved to make it appear that a small hand seemed to be gripping the bowl, which he carried from that point on. On more than one occasion, when a rabbit or squirrel chase was in progress with his troops, Hill would dismount and give chase right along with them. Expeditions and engagements were infrequent during this time, but the Light Division did destroy parts of the Baltimore and Ohio Railroad and fought some light engagements at Castleman's Ferry and Snicker's Gap. During this time, Hill wrote a telling letter to his friend Jeb Stuart, the commander of Lee's cavalry, about General Jackson. Hill wrote, "I suppose I am to vegetate here all the winter under that crazy old Presbyterian fool. I am like the porcupine, all bristles, and all sticking out too, so I know we shall have a smash-up before long. I don't like the complexion here. I think a fatal sin has been committed, provided the Yanks have the sense to take advantage of it, which they don't often do, for they sometimes won't take the peach when held to their lips. The Almighty will get tired helping Jackson after a while, and then he'll get the darndest thrashing. And the shoe pinches, for I should get my share and probably all the blame, for the people will never blame Stonewall for any disaster." When Abraham Lincoln replaced George McClellan with Ambrose Burnside, the new Union commander launched his own campaign to hopefully capture Richmond by crossing the Rappahannock River at Fredericksburg, but Lee shifted his army to that location, blocking Burnside's attempt, which was hindered by the slow movement of the pontoon bridge to the army. Jackson's corps formed on the Confederate right on Prospect Hill, overlooking the river and the Richmond, Fredericksburg, and Potomac Railroad. As Hill was on his way to post his troops, he received word that Nettie had died of diphtheria. His grief may be the reason that the disposition of his brigades seemed unusual and dangerous for the Confederates. A gap emerged in the front line nearly 600 yards wide. Gregg's brigade sat above the gap, but the dense forest reduced the visibility to zero. Who was to blame for this? Many people. Jackson should have inspected his lines more thorough, as well as Hill. Both Lane and Archer had the responsibility of notifying his division commander of the gap. Archer claimed that he did notify his division commander, but nothing was done. Jeb Stuart rode near Hill's lines and saw the gap, but declared that the Federals could not get close enough to threaten the Confederate line. Ultimately, Hill should have been aware of the gap and fixed the situation. Some historians have suggested that Hill did not want to subject his troops to the cold, swampy ground in that sector, so he did not assign them to that area, but this is speculation. Nevertheless, it would prove a dangerous mistake. As Union forces were forming in their front, Jackson and Hill met. Hill was in his usual attire, black felt hat, calico shirt, wool shell jacket, trousers stuffed into knee-high boots, saber and revolver strapped to his waist. Jackson looked unnatural in a new, elaborate uniform, a recent gift from Stuart. When the fog lifted, the Union division of George Gordon Meade made their appearance on the field. 47 cannons began firing from Hill's division, knocking holes in Meade's line, but on they marched. It became evident that the blue troops were headed straight for the exposed gap in Hill's line. The Pennsylvanians turned Archer's left flank and headed for Gregg's South Carolinians. In the confusion of having to restore order to his troops, Gregg was shot and tumbled from his horse, mortally wounded. Another Union division smashed into Hill's left and began pushing it back. As General Pender came riding down his line amid the ricocheting of bullets, his staff noticed his left arm hanging limp and blood dripping down his fingers. When his staff asked about his condition, he said, "Oh, that is a trifle, no bones broken," and continued the examination of his line. Hill's reserve and the division of Jubal Early pushed back the stubborn Federals. Jackson's front had been restored and other divisions took Hill's place. The Light Division took heavy casualties, amounting to 231 killed, 1,474 wounded, and 417 missing. 2/3 of Jackson's losses came from Hill's division. Hill visited the hospital, and according to a chaplain, I remember seeing him visiting, as was his custom, looking after the comfort of his wounded, and with his own hands lifting some of the poor fellows into more comfortable positions. Some historians have pointed to two factors that led to the gap in Hill's line. One, Hill was already not speaking to Jackson in any great length, which may have hidden the disposition of his troops from his corps commander. Two, he was grieved at the loss of his daughter and had become distraught, playing no active part in the engagement. Hill normally fought alongside his troops in the front lines, but this battle was different. He was hardly seen by his troops or brigade commanders. That led to a rumor that he had even been captured. Never had this happened in Hill's Civil War career. The only difference in this battle and others is the death of his child right before the battle transpired. After the battle, the Light Division moved 8 miles downriver to a location the men christened Camp Gregg after the slain general. It would be here that they would regroup and recuperate from the hard fighting of 1862 and prepare for the spring campaign of 1863. During January 1863, Hill's men were marched to witness the execution of Private Patrick McGee of the 1st Virginia for desertion, robbery, and perjury. For a short time, Hill was the president of a court-martial for the 1st Corps. When it concluded, he forwarded this message to Longstreet: "I send you over the record in the case of Youngblood, whom we have directed to be executed. If the sentence meets the approval of the general, I would suggest that the sentence be published at once to the army, and also that the prisoner be notified at once of his fate. Our desire to promote the efficiency of the service and its proper discipline, and suggestions coming from the Lieutenant General are always received with pleasure and never regarded as any incursion of our privileges, and I hope no hesitancy will be felt in freely making them." The destruction of Fredericksburg during the battle caused many Confederate soldiers to feel sorrow for the citizens. Hill's Light Division donated $10,000 to their relief. While in winter quarters, as always, Dolly was not far behind Hill. She made her and the kids a home in a house a few yards away from Hill's headquarters. Dolly was now pregnant again and contracted diphtheria during this winter, but after it ran its course, she was back to her old self. In mid-February, on one of the trips Hill took to Richmond, the Virginia House of Delegates made him an honorary member. Hill told the delegates, "The knowledge that what little I have done in the service of my country is appreciated by the legislature of my native state is sufficient to nerve my arm in the future. I shall endeavor to merit the appreciation so generously bestowed." Hill also had to change the command structure. Colonel Brockenbrough had not filled the shoes of General Field when he took over the brigadier's unit temporarily. Hill had to replace him, and he did so with Henry Heath, his childhood friend and West Point classmate. Hill had also been a groomsman at Heath's wedding in 1857. Now he had to replace General Gregg. He knew that the South Carolinians were some of his best fighters, and Gregg taught them well, so he had to choose a capable commander, and he did. He chose Colonel Samuel McGowan of the 14th South Carolina. Cheers went up from the brigade when his promotion was announced. During the first 4 months of 1863, the Hill-Jackson feud hit a whole new level. Lee attempted to squash the feud by informing Hill that Jackson did accept his release. Hill still wanted to be vindicated. Only a court of inquiry could decide if he had been right in his actions. Two events brought the feud to a boil. One, Jackson's chief of ordnance bypassed Hill to inform Hill's chief of ordnance to perform a small task. Hill took this as Jackson breaking military protocol. Lee even informed Hill that if Army orders had to pass through that many hands, it would add considerable red tape and make the Army less efficient. Then an information leak happened in Jackson's Signal Corps. Lee wanted to know who leaked the information that was being widely discussed in Hill's Light Division. Jackson found out it was Hill's signal officer who had leaked the information and relieved him of duty without informing Hill. When Hill did find this out, he was irate that again Jackson interfered with his division without the division commander's knowledge. Somehow a communication was put on Jackson's desk. It was a note from Hill telling his signal officer to ignore orders from Jackson unless they came through him first. To Jackson, this was insubordination. Jackson sent over all documents for Lee to look over, as did Hill, but Lee was more worried about the upcoming campaign. It was late April, and the fighting would soon commence. Jeb Stuart detected the movement of Joseph Hooker's army as it left a third of its force under John Sedgwick at Fredericksburg, while he marched the rest to cross the Rappahannock River to the west. Lee had to move quickly. By April 30th, Hill's division was on the road to meet the Federal Army in a densely wooded area known as the Wilderness. Lee, Jackson, and Hill looked over maps, and it was determined that Hill would proceed down the Orange Turnpike to the crossroads at Chancellorsville to fill out the enemy. The brigades of Lane, Heath, and McGowan marched west and became hotly engaged. Jackson summoned Hill to ride with him to the front. He did so, and as they got closer to the fighting, Hill dismounted. A soldier remembered Hill was standing with several officers around him. He was holding the reins of his horse bridle in his left hand and was talking rapidly, and at the same time gesticulating vigorously with his right hand. We passed near enough to him to note his earnest manner. I remember that his presence and manner inspired me with confidence, for he impressed me with the conviction that he was a man whose spirit was rising as dangers gathered and thickened, that he meant business, and that he was going to win. Hooker had lost his nerve and was now in the Wilderness on the defensive. Stuart brought information to Lee that Hooker's flank was not anchored, it was in the air. Lee instructed Jackson to take his 28,000 men and march to the Union right flank and hit it with all the force he could. On the morning of May 2nd, the divisions of Rhodes, Colston, and Hill moved out to make the march. The Light Division was in the rear. After marching miles to get into position, Rhodes formed the first line, Colston's division was behind him, and Hill was forming up his men, but the day was getting late, and part of his division had engaged briefly with the Federals, so his brigades were more strung out than the other two divisions. At 5:15 p.m., Jackson launched his assault with only two-thirds of his force. Jackson's corps slammed into the unsuspecting Federals, and the chase was on. Lost in the glory of Jackson's greatest flank attack is the fact that it was rather badly organized and somewhat mismanaged. Rhodes swept ahead with Colston only 150 yards behind him. As a result, when a segment of Rhodes's line slowed down from obstacles or fatigue, a portion of Colston's line bumped into it. Further, Hill's brigades were still deploying when the assault began, and were of no use in the first stage of the battle. All too quickly, the sharpness of Jackson's offensive broke down. By 7:30, Jackson's powerful assault had lost most of its momentum. Jackson still had one division unengaged, the Light Division. He called up for Hill to bring his division to the front and push northeast to cut the Federals off from the fords across the rivers to the north. Lane's North Carolinians were in the lead, deployed across the Plank Road. It was now 8:30 and a full moon was peeking through the trees. Lane directed his men to fire on the first men they saw coming. Even with the moon, it was still too dark to move any great distance, so Lane rode to find Hill to get further instructions. Lane found Jackson riding slowly down the road. He told Jackson he needed further instructions, and Jackson stated, "Push right ahead, Lane." Hill with his staff then came running down the road to meet with Jackson. The calm that had marked Jackson all the trying day was gone. He was now excited. He sensed the kill if pressure against the Federals could be maintained. Jackson returned Hill's salute and asked, "How long before you will be ready to advance?" "In a few minutes," Hill replied, "as soon as I can finish relieving General Rhodes." Jackson asked, "Do you know the road from Chancellorsville to the United States Ford?" Hill paused for a second. "I have not traveled over it for many years." Jackson then turned in his saddle to his young engineering officer. "Captain Boswell, report to General Hill." Then Jackson looked hard at Hill and exclaimed, "Press them, General Hill, press them and cut them off from the United States Ford." At 9:15, the Light Division began groping through the dark unknown. Jackson and his staff rode behind the 18th North Carolina during its slow advance, then passed through its lines. An officer asked, "General, don't you think this is the wrong place for you?" "The danger is all over. The enemy is routed," Jackson shouted. "Go back and tell A.P. Hill to press right on." Jackson then rode to find the Federal line in the darkness. Hill was doing the same. Hill's chief engineer accidentally rode into a Union battery and was captured. Now both Jackson and Hill met up as they made their way back to the Confederate lines to send their men forward. The sharp crack of a musket broke the silence. Then a volley of rifle fire from nervous Southerners rolled through the woods. Confederate musketry triggered Union artillery, and a salvo of shells ripped through the trees and ricocheted up the road. The group of the two generals and their staff numbered nearly 20 men. To one North Carolinian, the sound of the group sounded like a brigade of cavalry running at a rapid gait. Hill got to within 20 yards of Lane's brigade, trying to clear a path for the party to move through. He yelled for the North Carolinians to stop firing. Captain Alfred Toller of the 18th North Carolina yelled that it was a line to pour it into them. When the Confederate volley hit the group of horsemen, the party ceased to exist amid a turmoil of anguished shrieks, piercing cries, men falling to the ground, other riders reeling in the saddle as mounts bolted in every direction. Hill miraculously had not been hit and immediately dismounted and lay face down on the ground for a few seconds. He then remounted hastily and rode toward Lane's position with a cry half in anger and half in shock. "You have shot my friends. You have destroyed my staff." He came up to one of his favorite aides, 19-year-old Captain Murray Forbes Taylor, who was pinned beneath his dead horse. Hill was in the process of extricating Taylor when a courier dashed up and announced in a trembling voice that Jackson lay seriously wounded some 50 yards away. "Help yourself," Hill said to the half-freed Taylor. "I must go to General Jackson." Then, as an afterthought, Hill stated in a hushed voice, "Don't tell the troops about the general." Hill raced over to the base of a pine tree where Jackson was laying. He told the bleeding general that he was trying to get the men to stop firing, and then asked if the wound was painful. "Very painful," Jackson replied. "I think my arm is broken." Hill carefully removed Jackson's gauntlets, which were blood-soaked. Then he took off the general's saber and belt. Next, in a characteristic display of compassion, Hill sat down on the ground and cradled Jackson's head in his lap while he gently tore open Jackson's left sleeve and tried with handkerchiefs to stem the hemorrhaging. Captain Adams bent over and offered his flask of brandy. The pious Jackson hesitated, then drank a small swallow. Dr. Richard Barr, an assistant surgeon in Pender's brigade, made his way to the men, led there by Captain Benjamin Lee. Jackson whispered to Hill, "Is he a good surgeon?" Hill replied that he stood in high regard in the brigade for his ability and assured him that nothing drastic would be done until Dr. McGuire, Jackson's personal physician, arrived. The battle lines were now intermingling as each side tried to determine where the other was. Hill looked up and saw two Union soldiers a few yards away. Hill softly told two of his orderlies to arrest the enemy soldiers. The two men dropped their weapons without resistance. Hill eased out from under the general. "I will try to keep your accident from the knowledge of the troops," he said. "Thank you," Jackson replied. Hill, knowing he was now temporarily in charge of Jackson's corps, proceeded on foot, with pistol drawn, to Heath's position to make sure his battle lines were stable and superintend the brigades. He then turned to go back to where Jackson lay when a quick burst of artillery fire came from across the way. Searing pain shot across the back of his legs below the knee. A shell fragment had ripped off the top of his boots. Hill reached down to feel for blood. He could detect none, yet both legs were so numb that he could barely stand. He limped for a few steps, but the pain in one leg forced him to sit down on a stump of a large oak. Upon removing the boot, he saw blood on the underclothing. Hill slowly mounted his horse. He rode to the front, one foot sticking out from the stirrup. A member of Hill's staff rode up to him and asked if he was wounded. Hill replied, "Yes, I have been shot in the calf of the leg. I fear the wound is serious enough to incapacitate me from continuing in command." Hill remained in the saddle while his staff went in search of Stewart. Sometime near 10:30, Stewart made it to Hill's position, and Hill formally turned over command of his corps to Stewart. Hill then proceeded to the rear on a litter. The next day, as Stewart was directing the attacks against the Union lines, Hill would be present in case Stewart needed help or if he could be of service positioning troops. Stewart explained that he was grateful to Hill for his help and presence on the battlefield. Hill had to ride in an ambulance to the various locations on the battlefield, and his limited mobility prevented him from traveling at a rapid pace. On May 6th, Hill asked Lee to be put back in command of the corps, which Lee granted, and Stewart went back to his cavalry. Out of Lee's 12,000 casualties, 416 of the dead and 2,171 of the wounded were in Hill's division. It was a great victory over the numerically superior Army of the Potomac, but it came at a horrible cost. Jackson's arm had to be amputated and pneumonia set in. In Jackson's delirium, he called for Hill and his division. and would pass away on May 10th. With Jackson gone, Lee needed to replace him. Jackson's staff criticized A.P. Hill. Jackson's mapmaker, Jed Hotchkiss, told his wife that Hill was a good military leader, but he was not a man of God and did not wear the sword of the Lord and of Gideon. Dorsey Pender hoped that Hill would take Jackson's place because, as he said, "I hope to stick to him, for he sticks with me." Lee had 6 candidates in the run-in to succeed Jackson: A.P. Hill, Richard Ewell, D.H. Hill, Richard Anderson, Lafayette McLaws, and John Bell Hood. Hill was the front-runner. Lee told Jefferson Davis, "I think upon the whole, Hill is the best soldier of his grade with me." Ewell was also highly considered. For one reason, he had been closest to Jackson, starting with the 1862 Valley Campaign. He had lost a leg at Groveton in August and was now able to walk. Many people viewed Ewell as Jackson's natural successor because of his closeness to Jackson. On May 23rd, Ewell was named commander of the 2nd Corps. The next day, Lee called Hill to his headquarters. They started a friendly conversation, then Lee got to the point. He expressed that having just 2 corps had become unwieldy, and that he was organizing the army into 3 corps, and Hill would command the 3rd. Longstreet and Porter Alexander complained that other field officers were more qualified and that Hill had been chosen primarily because he was a Virginian. Davis wrote a letter after the war stating, "There had been complaints in certain quarters that Virginia was getting more than her fair share of the promotions, but in truth was that A.P. Hill was so clearly entitled to the place, both on account of his ability as a soldier and the meritorious services he had rendered, that General Lee did not hesitate to recommend him, and I did not hesitate to make the appointment." On the day after his promotion, an official report came across Hill's desk stating that the 58th Virginia had lost its colors after hastily retreating after heavy losses. They requested to be given another flag, but Hill refused, saying they would only get a new flag when they captured an enemy flag. One of Hill's biographers stated, "Such concern over regimental behavior was the stuff of which excellent brigadiers and fighting division commanders were made. Lieutenant generals in charge of corps had of necessity to focus on the bigger picture. They were expected to give more attention to planning and organization, with correspondingly less involvement in combat leadership. Hill would never quite master that transition." Hill needed to adjust the command structure in the new 3rd Corps. Each corps would have 3 divisions. Naturally, the Light Division would be included in Hill's corps, but who would lead it? Hill helped make the division famous throughout the Confederacy and the Union, so its successor needed to exemplify similar qualities and possess the respect of the men. Hill was torn between 2 candidates. Henry Heath was senior to the other brigadiers in rank and proved himself a capable commander. However, Dorsey Pender entered the Light Division from its inception and climbed the ranks. Hill stated, "General Pender has fought with the division in every battle, has been 4 times wounded and never left the field, has risen by death and wounds from 5th Brigadier to its senior, has the best drilled and disciplined brigade in the division, and more than all, possesses the unbound confidence of the division." He suggested taking 2 brigades from the Light Division, Archer and Heath's, and combining them with 2 other brigades to create a new division under Heath. Then what was left of the Light Division would be placed under Pender. Lee agreed to that compromise. Heath and Pender formed 2 of the 3 divisions in Hill's corps. The last division came from Longstreet's corps under Richard Anderson. Anderson's division contained a veteran force of 5 hard-fighting brigades that would perform good service for Hill. Heath commanded the most inexperienced and least reliable troops in the corps. Johnson Pettigrew's North Carolinians and Joseph Davis's Mississippi Brigade were new to the Army of Northern Virginia. Both were untested in combat, and Heath had only been with the Army for 3 months. He had served in the Western Theater before being transferred to the East. Powell Hill needed to handle this new corps carefully, with new troops and the fact that many of these brigades and divisions had never worked together. On June 3rd, Lee sent Longstreet and Ewell's corps to the west, leaving Hill at Fredericksburg to watch the Union forces and confuse them as to Lee's intentions. Lee gave Hill open instructions. If Hooker pushed across the river, Hill was to fall back along the railroad, but if Hooker disappeared, Hill was to pursue the enemy. Before Ewell's corps got out of sight, the Union opened up an artillery bombardment and began crossing the river. Lee stopped his columns, but by June 6th, Lee determined that the demonstrations had been simply a probe and not a major attack. Thus he continued his march to the west. Ewell and his corps entered the Shenandoah Valley and then would press on into Maryland and Pennsylvania. while Longstreet held a position around Culpeper to support Hill if Hooker pushed south. On June 13th, 10 days after Lee began his campaign, Hooker discovered the movement. Lee had stolen a march on the Union commander, and he pursued. Once all Union forces left his front, Hill marched his divisions west, heading up the valley and toward Pennsylvania. Longstreet brought up the rear. On their way up the valley, just north of Front Royal, Hill's men entered a clearing where a host of bats flew close to the ground. The men began swinging at the bats with sticks for sport. Hill and his staff dismounted and participated in the fun. On June 24th, Hill and Longstreet met at Lee's headquarters for a conference. A little boy named Leighton Parks, whom Lee had met on the Maryland invasion the previous year, came to the tent with a bucket of raspberries as a present. Lee thanked him and invited him to stay for lunch. Lee sat the boy on his knee and played with the child as he would his own. The two corps commanders insisted that they also have the privilege to engage with the child, which Lee obliged. Longstreet, his family wiped out by yellow fever a year earlier, enjoyed his time with young Parks, but it then became time to discuss matters of war. Hill called for a horse to take the young man back home. Lee placed him in the saddle and said, "Give him time and he'll do for the cavalry yet." Heath's division, on orders from Hill, marched through Cashtown and toward the little town of Gettysburg, with orders to search the town for supplies, especially shoes, but sending such a large force on a 20-mile round-trip march without cavalry to a town through which Jubal Early's division had marched just a few days prior seemed foolhardy. On the morning of July 1st, Hill remained confined to a cot in excruciating pain from possibly a flare-up of his prostatitis. He admitted he was unwell all day. He directed Heath to not bring on a general engagement, but unbeknownst to them, this would erupt into the largest battle in North America. Heath's division became engaged with Union forces around the town of Gettysburg. Near Willoughby Run, many of Archer's brigade became prisoners, including Archer himself, as the Marylander marched to the rear of Union lines. One of his West Point classmates, Abner Doubleday, rode up and said, "Good morning, Archer. How are you? I am glad to see you." Archer fired back, "Well, I am not glad to see you." Doubleday turned into the saddle and told one of his staff to take the obstinate Confederate to the rear. As the fighting intensified, Hill remained at Cashtown, attempting to regain his strength. Lee rode into town and met with Hill, who could not give the army commander any further information about what was happening at Gettysburg. Painfully, Hill mounted his horse and started eastward. Lee, Hill, and Heath met on a ridge near Willoughby Run, where Pegram's artillery was firing into the Union position. As they watched the duel, a Federal artillery shell exploded over the 16th North Carolina. A small shell fragment scraped the head of a captain in that regiment. Blood started to trickle down the man's head, and he ran to the rear yelling, "I'm dead, I'm dead." The colonel of the regiment yelled to two stretcher bearers, "Go and take that dead man off, if you can catch him." When Lee saw the Federal right flank beginning to crumble, he instructed Hill to send Heath and Pender into the engagement. The Federals began running through the town and took up positions on Cemetery Hill and Cemetery Ridge. Hill's men occupied Seminary Ridge. Hill achieved admirable accolades for the engagement on the first day of Gettysburg. Lee needed information about the enemy's whereabouts, and it was Hill that was tasked to do so with his infantry. His men found the Federal force at Gettysburg and engaged them, and with the help of General Ewell, drove them from the field. Although in great pain, Hill persevered and delivered a devastating blow to the blue columns. Sending such a large force on a reconnaissance mission seemed odd, but Hill's insistence on Heath and Pender advancing together allowed the Confederates to keep constant pressure on the Union and led to victory that day. It was Thursday, July 2nd, at around 6 a.m. when Hill ordered Anderson's division to replace Heath's division at the front. Powell then went to Lee's headquarters, where Longstreet soon arrived. Lee sat on a fallen tree and placed a map on his lap. Hill and Longstreet stood and looked over the map with the army commander. Lee explained that Longstreet would attack the Union right, and when the fighting got to Hill's sector, then Hill's corps would engage the enemy. Hill's front line acted as the center of the Confederate line, with Pender's division constituting Hill's left and Anderson on the right. Heath's division, now under Pettigrew, remained in reserve. The morning hours passed away as Hill waited for Longstreet to attack. Images of the 7 days battles must have run through his head as he waited for someone else to attack. Lee and his staff joined Hill in waiting for the attack. Hill asked for some water from his aide, who returned with a bucket of dirty water. The aide apologized but informed the general that no good water could be found within a mile. The aide asked if Hill would want to wait for better water. Hill declined and drank for a long time from the bucket. Most of the time, the two generals sat on tree stumps or under shade trees in silence, waiting for Longstreet's men to launch their assault. As they waited, Jeb Stuart rode into view in the afternoon. Stuart and Lee exchanged a few words, then Stuart rode off. At around 4, artillery blasts and musketry could be heard to the south, meaning that Longstreet was on the move. Hill informed his artillery officer to open up with his 55 cannons and aid General Longstreet's attack. As the battle intensified, Hill climbed a tree to get a better view of the attack. When the battle came to Anderson's front, he was expected to join in the attack. Of course, Hill thought Anderson would be acting under the orders of Longstreet, and Longstreet thought that Hill would command the support. So Anderson acted independent of both commanders, forming on Barksdale's left. Wilcox's Alabamians, Lang's Floridians, and Wright's Georgians pushed to Cemetery Ridge. The Union forces counterattacked and drove the Confederates away from the hard-won ground. By nightfall, Hill's men rested where they stepped off a few hours before. Hill received word about this time that his close friend and division commander Dorsey Pender was horribly wounded by an artillery shell while organizing his troops. One of Hill's biographers stated of the second day at Gettysburg, "Left to his own devices in his first battle under Hill, Anderson was indecisive and sloppy in his actions. Even one of his privates saw the division's advance lacked concert of movement and resulted in a large sacrifice of life. Anderson did not even send in all of his brigades, as Hill desired. Mahone's Virginians never saw action, for reasons still not clear." Hill's leadership on July 2nd also left something to be desired. Maybe it was the fact that one division in his corps with which he was totally unfamiliar in combat was making the attack. Perhaps in spite of the surface cordiality between Hill and Longstreet, mutual resentment still smoldered, so that neither made any attempt to clarify the responsibility of Anderson's division. In addition, Hill could have ordered Heath's division or Pender's to enter the action. Possibly Hill, remembering the carnage of the previous day when he had attacked without specific instructions, decided to do nothing without directives from Lee. That night, Hill rode again to Lee's headquarters. This time he was met with multiple officers of Stuart's command, and he greeted and shook their hands. As he talked with them, Lee heard Hill's voice and came out to greet him. Lee took Hill by the hand and said in a fatherly manner, "It is all well, General. Everything is well." Lee met with Longstreet and Hill to discuss the next day's fight. The Confederates would target the Union center, using 3 divisions, 1 from Longstreet's corps under George Pickett and 2 from Hill's corps, Heath's division, now under Pettigrew, and Pender's division, that would be commanded by Major General Isaac Trimble, who was without command. Longstreet would assert control over these 3 divisions and use them in the assault of the Union center. In the late morning of July 3rd, Lee conferred with Longstreet and Hill. Hill was enthusiastic about the assault and suggested for the entire 3rd Corps to take part. Lee told him he needed the rest of the Corps to hold their position and be in reserve if Longstreet's assault failed. After conferring with Lee, Longstreet and Hill met a short distance away on a fallen tree and hashed out the details in a lengthy discussion. The 2 men parted without even shaking hands and didn't communicate with one another the rest of the day. Hill rode off to his brigade and division commanders and informed them to take orders from Longstreet. Hill assumed that Longstreet would take command of his divisions, and Longstreet assumed that Hill would possess some degree of control over his own men during the attack, so neither man really took charge of Hill's divisions. Around 1 o'clock, an artillery bombardment let loose from the Confederate side, and it quickly turned into a duel. At around 3 p.m., the Confederate line emerged from the tree line on Seminary Ridge. The 2 wings, because of the confusion in command, started off separately, with Pettigrew's division in the lead and Trimble in support. Pickett's division was on the right. As they advanced across the field, 3 horses fell under Pettigrew from the intense musketry. A piece of shrapnel wounded Pettigrew in the hand while he led his men forward on foot. Trimble received a serious leg wound that required amputation. All but one of the brigade commanders in Pettigrew's division became casualties in one form or another. The Confederate left faltered and gave way, producing a domino effect. Hill watched as the Confederate troops streamed back to Seminary Ridge. The 3rd Corps, in its first campaign, lost 7,671 men, 1,554 killed, 4,362 wounded, and 1,755 missing. As one of his biographers stated, promotion to Corps Command had in essence separated him from the ranks. He had to watch while others participated. It was not a natural role for Hill. He never handled it well, and it brought him more frustration than fulfillment. After sundown, Lee visited Ewell and Longstreet, then made his final stop at Hill's headquarters. They sat on camp stools and with the light of a single candle studied a map. Hill would take the lead of the retreat back to Virginia if Meade did not attack the next day. Lee traced the route to be used with his finger. At 1 in the morning the meeting ended, and Lee rode off. Hill attempted to get a few hours of sleep. At dark on July 4th, Hill's men began to file onto the road, preparing for a retreat. Hill was instructed to pass through the mountains above Fairfield and set up defenses. Once the other two corps got to that location, then the corps of Ewell and Hill would alternate as the lead column. A hard rain set in, which made the retreat more miserable for the defeated army. A soldier remembered, at length the loud laughter of the men comprising the head of A.P. Hill's column, advancing, banished every indication of sleep. They fought hard and were now falling back and wading to their knees in mud and mire. They were as cheerful a body of men as I ever saw, and to hear them, you would think they were going to a party of pleasure instead of retreating from a hard-fought battle. At Hagerstown, Hill waited for engineers to build a pontoon bridge at Fallen Waters. Ewell and Longstreet's corps passed by, then Hill's men brought up the rear. Most of the army crossed the Potomac River, leaving the divisions of Heath and Pettigrew on the other side. The two divisions were about 1.5 miles from the crossing when Hill ordered Heath to form his men into battle line perpendicular to the road and for Pettigrew to move to the pontoons. Assuming that Confederate cavalry screened his front, Heath did not send out skirmishers, so when cavalry appeared in his front, Heath assumed they were Stuart's cavalry providing a screen for the army. Heath's miscalculation and mismanagement resulted in a blow to the Confederacy. Just as the Confederate officers recognized the horsemen as Federals, the cavalry started galloping and charged into their midst. Before the altercation, Heath allowed his men to stack arms and rest, so when the Federal cavalry entered their lines, the rebel infantry grabbed what they could to defend themselves. One man wielded an axe, while another used a split rail to fight back against the horsemen. During the melee, Pettigrew attempted to mount his horse with his badly wounded hand, but the horse threw him. The North Carolinian jumped up and reached into his jacket to grab a pistol and then ran toward a Federal trooper. Before he pulled the trigger, the blue-clad soldier shot Pettigrew in the stomach. Pettigrew slumped over. One of the general's soldiers used a rock to kill the horseman, but the damage had already been done. After that brief skirmish where 39 Federals and 2 Confederates died, Hill crossed the river with the rest of the corps. They were now in Virginia. Once across the river, Hill encamped near Bunker Hill. As he rode around the perimeter of his lines, 2 cavalrymen from Jeb Stuart's cavalry attempted to pass through Hill's picket line in search of food with no passes, so the infantrymen would not let them pass. They took their case to the newly arrived Hill. He told them that he could not help them, since they did not belong to his corps, that they needed to get passes from Stuart. Then Hill smiled and said, "I'll tell you what you ought to do. Flank 'em." The horsemen took advantage of the fact that the infantrymen watched as they talked with Hill but could not hear the conversation, and walked up to the picket line and passed right through. Hill's pickets thought that meant that Hill gave them permission to pass through their lines. Hill said, "Well, that is the coolest and boldest flank movement I've ever saw." 2 deaths hit Hill's corps in rapid succession. Pettigrew, the 35-year-old North Carolinian, passed away. The next day, Pender succumbed to his wounds in Stanton, Virginia. The corps moved out, and by the 26th, they arrived at Culpeper, Hill's hometown. The return to his birthplace gave him great joy because he got to visit with his wife Dolly and daughter Russie. He stayed at the home of his brother Baptist and spent a week meeting with family and friends still in the area. The war took a terrible toll on the town. Confederate surgeons frequently used its buildings as hospitals, and now they appeared run down and dilapidated. Still, Hill relished his stay in Culpeper. After that brief visit, Hill shifted his course south to Orange Courthouse and took stock of the 3rd Corps. It was a shell of its former self, with only 11,207 men present for duty, the smallest corps in the Army. 2/3 of its animals became lost to the Gettysburg campaign, and the horses present were unserviceable. The Light Division needed to be refitted with rank-and-file soldiers as well as officers. Of the original brigadiers, Branch was dead, Gregg was dead, Pender was dead, Archer was a prisoner of war, and Field was incapacitated in just over a year of service. Only Thomas remained at the head of his brigade. To lead the Light Division, Hill appointed Cadmus Wilcox. One of Hill's biographers described him as such. Wilcox was a 40-year-old bachelor, a professional soldier who had been at West Point with Hill, McClellan, and Pickett. He was 6 feet tall, customarily wore a short round jacket and battered straw hat. Wilcox was not a deep thinker, but he was a tough fighter who, once a military objective had been fixed, drove toward that point unswervingly. Although Hill liked Wilcox personally, he maintained the same distance from him as from other officers. While camped around Orange Courthouse, a religious revival swept through the Army. Many regiments saw multiple converts during the revival, but Hill, an undemonstrative Episcopalian, would not become swept up in the religious fervor. He attended church on Sundays, but only attended other religious meetings if his wife wanted to attend. The Corps slowly began to grow as men came back from furlough, and those able to return after receiving wounds found their way back to camp. However, some men did not come back. They deserted, and Hill presided over the executions of many of his own beloved Light Division. By that point, the Army of the Potomac sat just across the Rapidan River from the Army of Northern Virginia, and in September, Lee dispatched Longstreet to the Army of Tennessee in the Western Theater. Likewise, Meade's army lost 2 corps to the Western armies for the Union. By mid-September, the 2 armies stood nearly evenly matched. Hill's corps grew to 16,300 men in the 3-month lull, and Hill began to chomp at the bit, ready for a fight. Lee, with the Union Army nearly equal in number to his, decided on a bold plan to turn Meade's flank and give chase when the Union Army retreated toward Washington. Hill's troops began their move to Culpeper, but found the town deserted. Meade had gotten word of at least Hill's corps moving in his direction and began pulling his forces back. The chase was on. When the 2 Confederate corps reached Warrenton, the infantry waited for the wagon trains to reach them, since the infantry outpaced the movement of the trains. Jeb Stuart reported to Lee that the Union corps were burning what they couldn't carry with them, and Lee saw this as the perfect opportunity to continue the pursuit and possibly destroy the Union Army in detail. Hill veered eastward for Bristow Station, and the young corps commander sensed a quick kill if he acted promptly. He rode at the head of his columns, hoping to spy the Federals in their retreat. On a plateau overlooking Bristow Station, he spied William H. French's 3rd Corps clustered together in mass as they awaited their turn to ford across Broad Run on their way to Manassas Junction. No time must be lost, Hill said. He ordered Heath's division to press down the road in battle line, destroying whatever came into their sight. His artillery opened up from a rise and caught the Federals completely off guard. At this point, Hill reverted back to his division commander days and placed Heath's troops and ignored the other 2 divisions coming up. As Heath's men pushed toward the Federals, Hill went to a rise to observe the battle, but something caught his eye over to his right. He had not reconnoitered the ground completely and did not see that not all the Federals were retreating. Behind an embankment on the Orange and Alexandria Railroad stood what Hill conceived of as a detachment of Union soldiers poised to sweep the flank of Heath's men. In fact, the detachment was 3,000 Union soldiers of Warren's 2nd Corps. Hill was fallen into a trap laid by the Union forces. Hill quickly stopped Heath's men and told the brigadier general on the right, John R. Cook, the brother-in-law of Jeb Stuart, that his flank would be in danger. Hill then went to the divisions he had ignored previously and ordered Anderson's men forward, but before they went into battle line, Hill ordered Heath's division forward again. As the division moved toward the ford, just as expected, the Federal musketry hit them in the flank. The division turned and was faced with either retreat or attack. They attacked, with one brigade breaking through the Federal fortifications. However, the 2nd Union line drove them back. Cook went down with a shattered shin bone. The Confederate line shattered, and since they possessed no support, the Federal troops hurriedly advanced, capturing prisoners and 5 pieces of artillery placed unsupported by Hill close to Heath's division. Nightfall brought the 40-minute battle of Bristow Station to a close. It was a horrible engagement for Hill, who lost significant manpower. His total losses were 1,378, or roughly 1 man lost for every 2 seconds of the engagement. The 27th North Carolina lost 290 men out of its 416, and 33 of its 36 officers were killed, wounded, or captured. In his report, Hill admitted his faults. "I'm convinced that I made the attack too hastily, and at the same time that a delay of half an hour, and there would have been no enemy to attack. In that event, I believe I should equally have blamed myself for not attacking at once." Lee and Hill rode over the battlefield as rain fell on the 2 generals. Hill explained the battle and repeatedly apologized throughout. When he finished, Lee said, "Well, well, General, bury these poor men and let us say no more about it." Although the Battle of Bristoe Station ended in disaster for the Confederacy, the campaign remained successful. Lee effectively drove the Army of the Potomac away from their encampments at the Rapidan in full retreat toward Washington, D.C., inflicted 2,292 casualties on the Union, and destroyed tons of Union material, including the Orange and Alexandria Railroad, which the Union used to supply their troops in Northern Virginia. The Battle of Bristoe Station was one setback in a successful campaign, but one that many people in the South would not forgive Hill for, and one Hill would never forget. One of Hill's biographers put it perfectly when he said, "What changed Hill was a combination of things. The larger responsibility of Corps Command was not appealing to him. Staying clear of combat, as he was forced by rank to do, was counter to his nature and talents. The attacks of prostatitis were becoming more frequent and more crippling. Most damaging of all, perhaps, Hill lacked the breadth of vision and wisdom to be superb at the head of a corps. Too often narrow and impetuous in his thinking, he did not have Jackson's deep confidence or Longstreet's unshakable calm. Unrivaled as a division commander, Hill simply did not or could not adjust as well to the next step up the military ladder." After the Battle of Bristoe Station, Lee called off the offensive. The Union Army was on the run, but they could get to the fortifications of Washington, D.C. before he could deliver a devastating blow to them. So the Army of Northern Virginia pulled back to the Rappahannock River, with the men encamped on the south side, huddled around campfires as the cold winter air hurt them inside and out. Hill was in a sour mood, and he hurt the feelings of some of his Culpeper friends when they offered him a 60-man contingent of local troops as a personal bodyguard. Hill responded, "I have no use for an escort. Besides, sir, I think that your 60 able-bodied men could render better service to the country by joining the ranks of some infantry regiment than by acting as bodyguard to any general." While in winter camp, two rumors swirled around the Confederate camps. One asserted that Lee placed Hill under arrest for mismanagement at Bristoe Station. Another one claimed Lee was transferring Hill and his corps to Tennessee. Both were false rumors. On November 1st, Hill got word from Richmond that Dolly had given birth to a daughter. In honor of Hill's sister and the man he most admired, this third girl was named Lucy Lee. Soldiers in Hill's corps affectionately built a rough-hewn cradle and presented it to the family. Also in early November, Meade's Army of the Potomac lunged southward, capturing about 2,000 soldiers of Ewell's corps near Rappahannock Station. Hill quickly removed his men to the south side of the Rapidan River. Meade, pressured by Washington to perform some action before winter fully set in, planned to slip around Lee's right flank near Mine Run and draw the Confederate general into open battle. Jeb Stuart's cavalry detected the flanking movement of Meade's army, and Lee quickly moved troops to block Meade's advance at Mine Run. Hill's men relieved the retreating cavalry, who delayed the Union advance, then formed up behind formidable breastworks to the west of Mine Run. November 30th passed with both armies jockeying for position and awaiting a movement by the other. Lee, Hill, and their staffs rode along the lines and came upon a group of soldiers huddled together in a prayer service. All of the riders dismounted and removed their hats and stood silently until finished. Afterward, Hill remained quiet and appeared, according to one of his staff, thoughtful almost to the point of tenderness. Not content waiting on the Union Army to make the next move, Lee ordered Hill to march in the darkness to Meade's left flank and rear, and at dawn attack, sending Meade's army into disarray. At dawn, Hill's men rushed forward, but only found abandoned camps. Meade's army had left during the night. Hill rushed forward to give chase, but was unable to catch up to the retreating enemy, only managing to capture around 200 men and a few muskets. Both armies then settled back into their former positions and awaited the spring. On December 6th, Lee, Stuart, and Hill attended the church service at the Episcopal Church in Orange, and the next day Hill wrote a thank you letter for a unique present. When his men returned to their places along the Rapidan, Hill received a pair of silver spurs as a gift from, as they termed themselves, the young countrywomen of Columbia, South Carolina. In their letter that accompanied the spurs, they announced that they vowed to never marry anyone but a Southern soldier. The following is Hill's thank you letter. My dear Miss Mary, the very handsome pair of spurs so kindly presented to me by yourself and young friends have been received, and I thank you most heartily for the token of goodwill and of the esteem in which you hold services incident to my position. If I have done aught to win these spurs, the gallant soldiers of your own native state are entitled partly to the credit. They have never faltered when the charge was sounded. The noble, steadfast devotion of the few in the field should cull a blush of shame to the cheeks of those who are fattening at home upon the distress of their country. At all events, mete out to them the punishment you threaten, and never let them know the cheer of a domestic fireside, or be smiled upon by heaven's last best gift, women. When these cruel wars are over, Miss Mary, I shall be reminded of Columbia, and I hope spurred to a visit in that direction to meet my kind friends. Please remember me affectionately to your young friends, and give to each a kiss for me, which I will repay to you with interest when we meet. Very affectionately, your friend, A.P. Hill. In December, Dolly came to Hill, and they spent some time together, but by January 7th, they traveled to Richmond to welcome her brother, John Hunt Morgan, back into the Confederacy. Just weeks before, Morgan escaped from a federal prison in Ohio and was now being given a hero's welcome in Richmond. General Stuart and John B. Gordon joined Hill on this journey. At the celebration, it was called on for Hill to speak, but he simply approached the crowd, bowed, and then retired. Stuart spoke, as one observer said, with all his voice. Before he left Richmond, he and Morgan visited Libby Prison and talked with some of the federal prisoners, particularly the ones from Kentucky. Hill, Dolly, John, and his wife attended church at St. Paul's Episcopal Church. Then Hill, Dolly, and the children traveled to the front. The family stayed in the three-story mansion of Colonel John Willis, with his headquarters tent pitched in the front yard. Lee made frequent visits to the estate to meet with Hill, and the two grew incredibly close. When rumors continued to swirl about more troops being sent to the Army of Tennessee, Lee informed Jefferson Davis he was willing to send any of his generals, except Hill. Hill also spent the winter defending one of his friends, Henry Heath. After Gettysburg, Fallen Waters, and Bristow Station, many accused Heath of incompetence. Heath went to Richmond with written testimonials attesting to his abilities. Hill's testimony read, "Having been informed that it was possible some misapprehensions existed in regard to your management of your division at Gettysburg, Fallen Waters, and Bristow, it is but simple justice to you that I say your conduct in all those occasions met with approbation." Hill repeated that the responsibility for Bristow Station was exclusively his. At Bristow, the attack was ordered by me and most gallantly made by your division. Another corps of the enemy coming up on your right was unforeseen, as I had supposed that the other troops were taking care of them. The Army healed from the Gettysburg and Bristow Station campaigns, with Hill's corps numbering around 19,000 men, many of them North Carolina troops. This concentration of Tar Heels brought the governor of North Carolina, Zebulon Vance, into the camp to deliver speeches, attended by Hill, Lee, and General Robert Rhodes. Word started to spread through the camp that Ulysses S. Grant from the west now took command of all Union forces and made his headquarters with the Army of the Potomac. Supplies like ammunition and bandages flooded the Army of Northern Virginia as the spring campaign approached. Generals' wives made their way out of the camp, but Dolly, as usual, stayed with her husband as long as she possibly could, planning to stay in Lexington during the campaign. Before she left on May 1st at St. Thomas Episcopal Church, Reverend Richard Davis baptized Lucy Hill in a small ceremony, with General Lee being named godfather. Lee held the infant throughout most of the service. Hill's staff, his wife, and Lee all saw a problem arising out of the 3rd Corps commander. He was not well. His prostatitis hurt him considerably, and he was growing weaker. By May, his walk was noticeably slow, his cheeks were becoming pronouncedly sunken, and a weary, sad haze seemed at times to cover those once flashing hazel eyes. For a period in March, he had to relinquish command of the Corps while he lay in bed sick. Not only did the prostatitis impact his health, nephritis, the inflammation of the kidneys, began around that time as well. From atop Clark's Mountain, Lee and his corps commanders, Longstreet, Ewell, and Hill, overlooked the landscape below. He concluded that Grant would move against his right, and that when Grant moved, they would move. At that moment, Lee's army sprawled over the countryside for guarding pivotal points and to reduce the stress on the landscape and civilians to supply soldiers with food. When Grant moved, it would be difficult to concentrate his army to counter the Union general's move. On May 4th, the Union army moved, and Lee reacted. Hill proceeded with Heath's division in the lead and Wilcox behind him. Anderson remained in the rear to guard the wagons. They traveled along the Orange Plank Road to block Grant. They camped by the road that night. Lee and Hill made their headquarters close together. The next morning, Hill's division began their march eastward. Lee rode with Hill on the Orange Plank Road as Ewell drove his men parallel to Hill on the Orange Turnpike. Passing their mine-run earthworks, they continued toward an area familiar to them, an area known as the Wilderness. The Orange Turnpike and the Orange Plank Road that Ewell and Hill marched on respectively began to diverge at about the moment Union forces started to engage Ewell to the north of Hill's columns. Lee urged Ewell to not bring on a general engagement until Longstreet could reach the position, but there was no stopping the Army of the Potomac under the purview of Ulysses S. Grant. A general engagement erupted on the Orange Turnpike, and Hill's men began to encounter resistance from Federal cavalry and a few infantrymen. Lee was in a desperate situation. The gap between his two corps threatened the integrity of the entire army. Because of the tangled mess of the Wilderness, road junctions proved vital for both armies, and both sought the Brock Road junction with the Orange Plank Road. Lee wanted it in order for Hill to arrive at the junction and push north to hit the flank of the Union soldiers attacking Ewell's front. However, Union forces arrived at that location first and began setting up fortifications. Hill, Lee, and Stewart sat in a clearing at the Whittletap Farm, which provided a good view of the ground before them. They studied a map, determining what Hill's corps could do to help relieve Ewell's embattled lines. All of a sudden, Lee rose up quickly. A Union battle line emerged from a pine thicket just 200 yards away. Stewart cautiously rose to his feet as well. Hill remained seated, due to the incredible pain it took to move. Hill gazed at the Union soldiers, but then, as quickly as they emerged, they retreated back into the thicket. Heath's division pushed forward, and about 4 o'clock, fighting in Hill's front began to rage. Winfield Scott Hancock threw 3 divisions of Union soldiers against Heath's 6,700-man division. Lee personally sent Wilcox's division north to hopefully link up with Ewell's right so that the front would be stable. With the battle raging in his front against overwhelming numbers, Hill ordered 16 artillery pieces under Pogue to form up in the clearing. A staff officer pointed out to him that in case of a breakthrough, no road existed to transport the artillery safely. Irritated, Hill stated, "I know this. In battle, the guns must take their chances of capture. They will help to hold the line if such an emergency occurs." Union brigades began battering Heath's line in front as well as on the flanks. Lee recalled Wilcox and ordered him to come in on Heath's left. With a shout, the South Carolinians under McGowan swept through the area like a tornado, as Wilcox described it, driving the enemy away from Heath's left flank. The reprieve was only momentary, and the Union lines reappeared, strong as ever. Some of Hill's Georgians remembered fighting at right angles and sometimes back-to-back against the Federal troops in the dense forest of the Wilderness. Regiments became entangled, and Hill, being the only unifying officer in many situations, personally directed his troops in this horrific encounter, all the while suffering from severe physical pain and a rising fever. Hancock continued his assault against Heath's men, and at least one brigade in Heath's division began using dead soldiers to form a breastworks against Federal bullets. It was growing dark when a courier rode up to Hill and informed him of a division headed toward the gap between his and Ewell's lines. Hill had committed all of his available troops, and he could not pull regiment out of line because that would make the whole line crumble. The only available unit was the 5th Alabama Battalion, who were guarding prisoners. Hill put them in a skirmish line, told them to rush through the bushes and woods screaming the rebel yell at the top of their voices, and to give every indication that they were the lead elements of several brigades. The Alabamians bravely did as they were told. This handful of soldiers crashed through the underbrush, fired their muskets rapidly, and screamed themselves hoarse. Wadsworth's Union division had gotten lost earlier in the day, and then had been pounded in the battle before getting lost a second time. When this new Confederate attack came toward them at nightfall, the Federals stopped in their tracks, threw up breastworks, and called it a day. This day represented one of Hill's greatest accomplishments as a corps commander. With only 15,000 men, he held off nearly 40,000 soldiers of the enemy. He placed troops effectively and inspired his corps with his presence at the front. However, Hill had fought against excruciating pain all day, and when night came, his fever got worse, and his whole groin hurt. He sat down and stared into a campfire, too exhausted to move in order to shore up his lines. Lee put forward his plan for the night and the next day. Hill would move his corps north to link up with Ewell, while Longstreet came up and took the place of Heath and Wilcox's divisions. If Hill did fill out a report, it has been lost. Heath's account remains the only good source on the situation, but his is suspect because it appears his intention was solely to absolve himself of blame. He claimed that he and Wilcox approached Hill to ask that their lines be reformed. Hill waved it off and said reforming in darkness so close to the enemy's lines was dangerous, and leaving the area meant leaving the wounded, for them to stay where they were. Hill added, "Longstreet will be up in a few hours. He will form in your front. I don't propose that your division shall do any fighting tomorrow. The men have been marching and fighting all day and are tired. I do not wish them disturbed." Allegedly, Heath came to Hill 3 times and requested to reform the lines, and on the last one, Hill angrily stated, "Heath, I don't want to hear any more about it. I don't want them disturbed." In that respect, Hill was just following Lee's orders for the men to rest until Longstreet arrived to relieve them. Heath also makes a ridiculous claim that he spent 2 hours searching for General Lee to go over Hill's head and claimed he could not find the army commander. The reason for this ridiculousness was Lee's headquarters sat right behind Heath's division, and Lee was in his tent all night, so Heath's story remains highly suspect. At 5 o'clock the next morning, Hill rode off to inspect the gap between his and Ewell's lines. Scarcely had he disappeared when Longstreet arrived at Hill's headquarters, greeted by a member of Hill's staff. Longstreet explained he was about 2 miles away, but as he did, a blast of musketry erupted in Hill's front. The Federals were attacking. For half an hour, Heath and Wilcox's men held their ground as best they could, gradually falling back. The more experienced soldiers performed a gradual withdrawal, while the less experienced rapidly fell back. In the clearing at the Widow Tap farm, the situation turned into a crisis, with Confederate troops streaming through the open ground. Wilcox approached Lee, wanting to know his instructions. Lee said, "Longstreet must be here. Bring him here." Wilcox sped off on his white horse up the Orange Plank Road to find Longstreet. Hill tried partially in vain to get his soldiers to reform. It was no use. By this point, no cohesiveness existed. Hill directed Pogue to fire double canister over the heads of the retreating Confederates at the Union troops pushing through the tree line. His staff worried that the artillery might hit wounded soldiers on the ground, but Hill simply stated the guns must open fire. Fire they did, blasting large holes in the Union lines. There was no Confederate infantry line. All that remained was Pogue's artillery. Hill, the former artilleryman he was, began helping to load and fire the pieces at the Federal soldiers. By 7, Longstreet's corps arrived and began pushing down the Orange Plank Road. Hill assembled his corps and pressed off to the north to fill the gap in the Confederate line. He reached an abandoned farm far ahead of his troops and dismounted to relieve the pressure on his lower back. He stood there studying the topography when just 100 yards away, a Federal line appeared. This was twice in 2 days he came close to either capture or death. Hill calmly told his staff, "Mount, walk your horses, and don't look back." The Federal troops were under Ambrose Burnside, and Hill quickly formed his corps to combat the approaching Union soldiers. Aggressively, Hill battled against Burnside and kept him at bay. When darkness covered the field, it brought a well-needed rest for the troops. The next day, Lee discovered Grant was on the move toward Spotsylvania Courthouse. He ordered Hill to the southeast to block Grant's movements. On this march, the pain required him to walk, not ride, and this drained him of his energy. He finally gave in to his illness and told Lee he could not continue. Lee placed Jubal Early in command of his corps, while Hill rode laying down in an ambulance near his troops. Early commanded Hill's troops effectively at the fight near Spotsylvania Courthouse, and when Lee convened a council of war at a church behind Confederate lines, Hill attended. Lee addressed General Heath by telling him to have his troops in readiness to attack. Hill spoke up and said, "General Lee, let them continue to attack our breastworks. We can stand that very well." Heath seconded the thought. Before he left, Lee stated, "This army cannot stand a siege. We must end this business on the battlefield, not in a fortified place." On May 15th, Hill felt he was well enough to take command and did so for a short time. During that period, Hill ordered General Wright's brigade to take a hill near Snell's Bridge across the Po River. Hill watched as Wright horribly mismanaged the situation so badly that another brigade had to be sent to complete the task. Hill was furious and vowed to haul Wright in front of a court of inquiry. Lee took Hill aside and gave him what amounted to a lecture. "These men are not an army. They are citizens defending their country. General Wright is not a soldier, he is a lawyer. I cannot do many things that I could do with a trained army. The soldiers know their duties better than the general officers do, and they have fought magnificently." Lee pointed out that a commander had to do the best he could with what he had. "You understand all of this, but if you humiliate General Wright, the people of Georgia would not understand. Besides, whom would you put in his place? You'll have to do what I do. When a man makes a mistake, I call him to my tent, talk to him, and use the authority of my position to make him do the right thing the next time." On the 16th, Hill relapsed, going back into excruciating pain, and rode in an ambulance again near the front. His doctor pleaded with him and then with his family to urge him to get a sick furlough to recover his health. Hill responded, "I cannot leave my command, and just as soon as possible I shall take charge of my brave fellows again." On May 20th, Ulysses S. Grant and the Army of the Potomac abandoned the area around Spotsylvania Courthouse. He would move to the southeast, continually attempting to cut Lee off and forcing the Confederate commander to move to protect the railroads and the Confederate capital. On the 21st, Lee met with several of his generals, including Hill, who urged that he was ready to take command of the corps again. Lee ordered it done, and they began discussing the upcoming movements. The Army of Northern Virginia shifted to the southeast. On the North Anna River, the Union Army found a river crossing at Jericho Mills. Lee, too ill to ride his horse, rode in a carriage to the location and declared it a feint that the Union Army would cross further downstream. Hill was unconvinced and sent Wilcox's division to investigate. He found Governor K. Warren's 5th Corps crossing in force and moving south in the trees following the river. Wilcox sent word to Hill, and Hill saw this as an excellent opportunity with a Union Corps isolated on the south side of the river. Hill told Wilcox to advance and attack. Later he ordered Heath to support Wilcox. The light division formed up and slammed into the Union soldiers, sending many of them fleeing. It looked like a chase until the Confederate left took significant damage and began to break, creating a disjointed attack where some brigades fled, others stayed put, and others attacked. This lack of cohesion resulted in Warren shoving the division back, and a rain brought the engagement to an end. Wilcox claimed Heath did not support him sufficiently, but in any sense, the Union troops on the field easily outnumbered the Confederates, and once Warren's men regained their composure after the surprise attack, they quickly mounted a successful counterattack. Hill's corps lost 650 men, and on May 24th, Lee went to Hill's headquarters in considerable pain, partly from stress and partly from other ailments like intestinal pain. Lee, in anger, asked, "Why did you not do as Jackson would have done, throw your whole force upon those people and drive them back?" Hill sympathized with Lee's pain, and in a reverent manner did not reply. Lee was frustrated, to say the least. He had lost the initiative to the Army of the Potomac. He was now simply countering Grant's movements instead of forcing Grant to make those counters. Lee's ideas resembled his plans a year or two previously, when his army was stronger and capable of sustaining such grand attacks. He realized that defense remained his best option, and something not in his nature. Hill and the Army of Northern Virginia again moved to counter Grant's movements. When the armies got to the Chickahominy River, Hill's corps occupied both flanks of the army, separated by the 1st and 2nd Corps. Hill located his headquarters near Gaines' Mill, where he fought courageously 2 years previous. The two divisions of Hill's corps on the Confederate right were situated near Cold Harbor. The Union 2nd Corps under Winfield Scott Hancock opposed them. At 4:30 a.m., 50,000 Union soldiers attacked 30,000 Confederates. Destruction reigned on the battlefield as Hill's men defended themselves against the blue assault columns. Confederate soldiers used bayonets and plates to scrape and dig small depressions during the lulls to withstand the infantry and artillery fire. One soldier in Heath's division remembered, "One line would fire and fall down, another step over, fire and fall down, each line getting nearer us, until they got within 60 or 75 yards of some portions of our line, but finding themselves cut to pieces so badly, they fell back in a little disorder. Our men seemed to rise all at once with a rebel yell and poured lead into them. The old field in front of us was almost covered with their dead." At 12:30, Grant called off the attacks, and each side took stock of their respective ranks. Lee had held off the assaults. Hill's men performed well, but the Union Army was again on the move. On June 13th, Lee received news that the Union lines were empty. Lee already dispatched Early with a sizable contingent to the Shenandoah Valley to deal with the Union threats in that region, so he moved what he possessed southward. Grant crossed the James River and struck out for Petersburg, a town of 18,000 people, but the site of 3 railroads and the place where a dozen highways all converged. The James River and the James River Canal both supplied ways for troops to move and thus illustrated its importance to Lee. Hill rushed some of his troops to Petersburg while others stayed to the northeast of Richmond to guard against a possible Union thrust in that direction. The situation remained perilous for the Army of Northern Virginia. They were outnumbered and the enemy was converging on the capital. On June 16th, multiple Union corps threw themselves at the works around Petersburg, commanded by Confederate General P.G.T. Beauregard, but to no avail. Hill now moved with the rest of his troops towards Richmond and Petersburg. A few days later, the Union Army struck out for the railroads to the southwest of Petersburg. Hill prepared his men for a counterstrike. Brigadier General William Mahone took over division command from Anderson when that commander replaced Longstreet after Longstreet's wounding in the Wilderness. Mahone graduated from the Virginia Military Institute and afterward became a successful railroad president. The ground through which Mahone's men were to attack had been surveyed by Mahone for the Norfolk and Petersburg Railroad. Mahone led his troops over the landscape expertly and approached the Union line without any indication of their presence. At 5 p.m., Hill gave the order to attack and Mahone's men swept over the blue troops, driving the men of Hancock's 2nd Corps. It quickly turned into a stampede, as Grant said. The Jerusalem Plank Road fight was a late afternoon affair that was short and one-sided. Mahone shattered 2 Federal divisions, inflicting 3,000 casualties, seized 4 guns and 8 regimental colors, all with minimum losses. The 1,700 Federals captured on June 22nd represented more prisoners than the 2nd Corps had lost at Antietam, Fredericksburg, and Chancellorsville combined. The next day, Hill sent Mahone on another strike against the Union left flank, where he captured another 600 Federals. After that, Mahone's men were given a good rest. They had been in the field for around 48 hours without sleep. By this point, both sides sat in their entrenchments opposing one another. On the morning of July 30th at 4:45 a.m., the earth below the 18th and 22nd South Carolina shot upward in an incredible explosion, throwing muskets, equipment, and men skyward, leaving a gaping hole 170 feet long, 70 feet wide, and 30 feet deep in the middle of Hill's line. 110 Union cannons let loose an immense bombardment. Hill was awake that morning and was resting on his cot at Corps headquarters when the explosion occurred. He leapt to his feet, took a quick look at the smoke swirling in the sky, and started for his horse. "I'm going to Mahone's division," he shouted to his staff. Before he left, he stated, "I will take his troops, all that can be spared, to the point of the explosion." He personally led troops to Mahone's aid, leading them up a ravine and then into open combat with the Federals, who marched across the expanse between the entrenchments to the crater. Amid the chaos, a powder and soot-covered South Carolinian asked an officer if he could join in the fight. The officer asked, "How high did they blow you?" The private responded, "I don't know, but as I was going up, I met the company commissary officer coming down, and he said, 'I will try to have breakfast ready by the time you get down.'" When Mahone brought more reinforcements to the crater, the Union troops began to give way and head for the rear. They left many of their comrades, both black and white, in the crater to be slaughtered by musketry and bayonets. At 3:25 p.m., Lee wired Richmond that Hill's men threw the enemy back and retook the ground. Although Hill played a significant role in plugging the large gap in the line, he gave the accolades to Mahone. He stated, "Anderson's division, commanded by Brigadier General William Mahone, has so distinguished itself by its successes during the present campaign as to merit the especial mention of the Corps Commander, and he tenders the division, its officers and men, his thanks for the gallantry displayed by them, whether attacking or attacked." The day after the successful defense of the crater, Lee held church service at his headquarters, with Reverend General William Pendleton conducting the service. Hill and Lee sat together, and during the service a small dog came up to the two generals, who gladly played with the rambunctious puppy while Pendleton preached. As both sides settled in for a siege, Hill complained to Confederate government officials about the putrid meat supplied to his corps, but the commissaries could do very little about the condition of the food. Hill attempted to keep his troops battle-ready despite the horrendous state of its supplies and the sad fact that desertion ran rampant through the whole army. In August, Grant launched another assault against the railroads south and southwest of Petersburg. Hill maneuvered his outnumbered troops effectively and thwarted multiple exploratory advances by the Union Army on the Weldon Railroad. Still, the Union Army persisted and held on to that railroad. Grant lost 4,455 of 20,000 men engaged over the course of the 4-day fight, and Lee lost 1,600 of the 14,000 engaged, numbers the Confederate Army could not afford. On August 25th, Lee maneuvered Hill's troops out of the entrenchments of Petersburg to attack the famed Second Corps of the Army of the Potomac with Winfield Scott Hancock at its head, who was ripping up large sections of the Weldon Railroad around Reams Station. Hill's troops outnumbered Hancock, and the unsuspecting Federals became easy prey for the Virginian. Using a combination of infantry and cavalry to attack Hancock from the south in order to grab the Union general's attention, Hill would then launch his main assault against Hancock's poorly placed works. Before he could order the assault, the pain in his kidneys and prostate forced Hill to lay down within sight of the Union earthworks, and he turned over the attack to Wilcox. The failed attack by Wilcox convinced Hill to put Heath in charge of the next attack, with Hill taking a supervisory role as his ailment would allow. Pegram's artillery preempted the attack, and Union soldiers felt the devastation. One soldier stated that the artillery bombardment turned their earthworks into kindling wood. Then the Confederate infantry made their attack, which swept over the Union earthworks and disintegrated the Federal Corps. Of the 2,700 casualties, 2,150 had surrendered on the field. Hill had followed Lee's directive to punish the enemy. Hill stated, "The saber and the bayonet have shaken hands on the enemy's captured breastworks." One of Hill's biographers stated of the Battle of Reams Station that it was a contest led by the Powell Hill of old, troops marching swiftly, falling on the enemy before he could be reinforced, attacking at the right place with sufficient numbers, hammering to a clear-cut victory. All of this worked at Reams Station because Hill was operating on the level where he was at his best, division command. He was incapacitated during part of the battle, but the overall scenario was his, and he directed the action with the same deft touch that had brought him into prominence early in the war. The main question for Hill now was whether his health would become a serious impediment. In September, Hill's spirits rose when Dolly and the children moved into the house across the road from his headquarters. He was in a generally good mood around this time. He laughed at William Pegram's news that the people of Richmond expected to evacuate soon. One day when riding through camp, he saw a chaplain handing out religious tracts. He reined his horse and asked the chaplain, "Do you think the boys would prefer hardtack or soft tracks?" At the end of September, Grant again extended his lines further to the west, and Lee again went to meet him in battle with Hill. Hill gained some success, but over the course of 2 days could do nothing more than slow down the Union advance, being greatly outnumbered. In mid-October, Lee wrote to Hill, "I wish you would see that all extra-duty men in all the departments, wagoners, cooks, clerks, couriers, and etc., that can possibly be spared, be placed in the ranks, that all the reserves, militia, and etc. around Petersburg be put in the trenches, and that as many of your old troops as you think it safe to take out be held in readiness for field service. We must drive them back at all costs." At a dinner party that offered a little reprieve from the war weariness, the discussion centered around the northern presidential election. Hill stated he would rather McClellan win the election, because if it becomes necessary to surrender, I would prefer to do so to McClellan. At the end of October, Grant again struck to the southwest of Petersburg, this time attempting to sever the Boydton Plank Road. Hill used the divisions of Wilcox, Heath, and Wade Hampton's cavalry to isolate the force under 2nd Corps Commander Winfield Scott Hancock after General Warren's 5th Corps Division got separated and entangled in a swamp. Heath's division struck Hancock's men so hard that it sent the Federals into a withdrawal. Hill's troops were too few in number to deal any devastating blow, but the quick movements and hard-hitting style of Hill's division commanders forced the Union troops to give up on the small campaign. In the fight, Wade Hampton lost a son, and Hill sent him a note reading, "My dear General, I take the liberty of writing to you to express my deep sympathy with you in the end of your noble boy, and my earnest desire, were such a thing possible, to alleviate your grief. Any assistance which I can give you in forwarding your wishes in any way, please do not hesitate to call upon me. With great sympathy, being truly your friend, A.P. Hill." After the fight for the Boydton Plank Road, both armies settled in for winter. Hill spent as much time as possible with Dolly and the children, getting frequent visits by General Lee. Dolly wrote, "General Lee comes very frequently to see me. He is the best and greatest man on earth. Brought me the last time some delicious apples." Surprising to Lee, Grant launched another offensive against the Weldon Railroad with Warren's 5th Corps. Lee pulled Hill's corps out of their Petersburg entrenchments and sent them after Warren, but Hill arrived too late. The freezing weather that slowed down his march convinced Warren, after successfully destroying a large section of the railroad, to pull back. Hill wrote to his sister, "Dolly and the children are with me, and we are just as comfortable as people can expect to be in these times. The children are growing so rapidly, doing so well. Russie is as fat as a butterball and the greatest talker you ever saw. And your little namesake, Lucy Lee, is certainly the sweetest little cherub ever born, gentle and genial as a May morning, and easily managed. I have just returned from the hardest trip I have ever had, down the railroad after Warren. I could not succeed in bringing him to fight, though I marched 40 miles one day and night. We succeeded, however, in turning him back from Weldon. Our army here, as always, is ready to do its duty, and men and officers in good spirits. I suppose now we shall, in addition to Grant, have Sherman on our hands too. Well, the Army of Northern Virginia is equal to it, and however much you tax its powers, will always respond, and I hope successfully." Hill attempted to hide his deteriorating health, but those around him saw its destructiveness. Protracted urinary and kidney infections had now progressed into uremia. Swollen kidneys, flank pain, inability to urinate, drowsiness from taut nerves, and lack of sleep all were making Hill increasingly lethargic. One of his staffers described him as an invalid. Hill's corps was whittling away as the winter months made it more difficult to get provisions and pay became irregular. The Tennessee Brigade dropped down to just 300 men. In February, Grant made another attack on the Boydton Plank Road, where Hill rushed Mahone's division to hold off the Confederate forces being routed there. The blue troops threw up breastworks to guard their newly acquired ground. On March 20th, Hill gave in to demands by staffers and friends to take a sick furlough. He, Dolly, and the children went to Chesterfield County to stay at the home of his uncle Henry Hill. His uncle held a position in the Confederate Paymaster Department, and after a week of rest, accompanied his uncle on a trip to the department. He chatted with people there and mentioned that he did not wish to survive the fall of Richmond if the city was ordered to evacuate. On March 31st, Hill returned to duty in command of the 3rd Corps, although he was not well. Rumors swirled around Richmond that Grant planned another major assault, and Hill wanted to command his troops in the struggle. On April 1st, Hill wheeled himself into the saddle and remained there for 15 hours, checking on his lines. The men in battle lines stood yards apart, but Hill inspected them nonetheless. When darkness came, Hill was exhausted, in great pain, and running a fever. That night he went to the cottage where his wife and children remained. That day, George Pickett's force got shattered at Five Forks, and now Lee's entire right flank was gone. Grant now prepared for a final assault. Hill couldn't sleep. He lay in bed, seeking relief from pain, exhaustion, fever, and worry. The sound of cannon fire rolled across the sky like waves of thunder. Bright darts of light from Union artillery outlined treetops and the horizon to the east, south, and west. As hard as he tried, Hill could not steer his mind away from the stark reality that all was coming to an end. Even a nap was out of the question. Hill gingerly eased himself out of bed and dressed. For some reason, he donned a white linen shirt that the now pregnant Dolly had recently made for him. Around 3 in the morning, Hill walked across the road to his headquarters tent. Sunday, April 2nd, would be a clear and warm day. A.P. Hill left his headquarters tent, mounted on his gray horse Champ, and headed to Lee's headquarters to get instructions from the commanding general. Each step that Champ made sent a shock through Hill's body. He was still in great pain. When he arrived at Lee's headquarters, Lee was lying on his bed. The two men were exhausted. At around 4 a.m., Longstreet arrived to discuss the day's actions. Colonel Charles Venable of Lee's staff rushed into the room as the three generals were speaking. Wagons and men were streaming down the road. Union soldiers were spotted not far away from the headquarters. Lee froze in shock. This meant that Grant's soldiers had penetrated the entire Confederate right and were pushing east. Lee hastily threw a cloak around his shoulders and went out on the front porch. When Lee turned to give Hill instructions, he found Hill already hobbling toward his horse, intent on finding where his men were and try to rally them. Lee sent Venable after Hill to tell him not to expose himself to enemy fire. Hill, Venable, George Tucker, and Courier William H. Jenkins headed southwest in search of information as to where the Confederate and Union lines were. The only good thing for the Confederates was that the success experienced by the blue troops led to the regiments, brigades, and divisions becoming disorganized in the pursuit of the Confederates. After sending Venable to place some artillery, Hill and the two other men came upon two Federal soldiers. Tucker and Jenkins rode up to the men with pistols drawn, demanding surrender, which they did. Hill told Jenkins to take the men to General Lee. Hill had no way of knowing that as he traveled, he was now in the right rear of the Union Army in its advance. As they got close to some huts that had been part of Mahone's winter quarters, the two men saw men milling around the area. Tucker asked whose men they were. Hill replied, "The enemy's." "Sergeant," Hill said with an earnest tone, "I must go to the right as quickly as possible." Pointing in that direction, Hill added, "We will go up this side of the branch to the woods, which will cover us until reaching the field in the rear of General Heath's quarters. I hope to find the road clear at General Heath's." Tucker made no response, but he rode with his Colt revolver in his hand. He touched his horse and got a little ahead of Hill. The two men crossed the Boydton Plank Road, came to a small woodland, and followed its edge southwestward for about a mile. Not a soldier, Union or Confederate, was in sight. Hill suddenly spoke up, "Sergeant, should anything happen to me, you must go back to General Lee and report it." As they came out of the woods into an open field, they saw Federal troops massed in the road. Both men halted. When Tucker asked what they should do, Hill pointed to a clump of woods about 150 yards away. "We must keep to the right," he said. As they neared the woods, Tucker saw Union soldiers in those woods. Two of them took aim with their rifled muskets. In a low tone, Hill said, "We must take them." Hill drew his revolver and placed Champ's reins in his left hand. Tucker went forward just 20 yards from the Union soldiers and demanded their surrender, bluffing that their men lay just a short distance away. Hill also called for them to surrender. The men they were shouting at behind the tree were two members of the 138th Pennsylvania. Corporal John W. Malk, a 29-year-old carpenter from Bedford County, Pennsylvania, looked down at his compatriot, Private Daniel Walford. "I cannot see it," Malk whispered. "Let us shoot them." And both men fired. Wolford's shot missed Tucker, but the bullet from Malk cut off Hill's left thumb in the gauntlet, passed directly through his heart, and ripped out his back. Hill died instantly. The impact of the projectile spun his body around, and he fell face down to the ground. Instinctively, Tucker grabbed for Hill, but his hand closed around Champ's bridle. Tucker turned to check on Hill, but his motionless body let him know that the general was gone. He took hold of Champ, a superior horse to his own, and mounted the general's horse and retraced his steps. He first encountered Longstreet and told him the news. Then he met with the rest of Hill's staff to inform them of the general's death. The staff then rode to General Lee's headquarters. When Lee heard the news, tears welled up in his eyes, and in a choking voice he said, "He is now at rest, and we who are left are the ones to suffer." Less than half an hour after his death, the 5th Alabama Battalion and members of Hill's staff recovered the body, still warm and undisturbed. No Federal troops were in sight. They apparently departed the area after the shooting. Lee told William Henry Palmer of Hill's staff to break the news as gently as possible to Dolly, and then get her and the children as quickly as possible to the north of the Appomattox River. Palmer rode to the cottage where the family was staying. He could hear the 7-month pregnant Dolly singing as she did chores. Palmer knocked on the door. The singing stopped. When she opened the door, Dolly threw up her hands and screamed, "The general is dead. You would not be here if he had not been killed." The chief of staff tried to soften the announcement by saying that he had been shot, but he did not know if he was dead. A few moments later, soldiers brought Hill's body to the cottage. Palmer was ordered to assist General Longstreet, so Captain Frank Hill, the general's nephew, and Jenkins accompanied the remains, along with Dolly and the children, to the safety in Richmond. The body was laid in the only army wagon that could be found, a dilapidated vehicle with no two wheels alike in appearance or size. Hill's cape covered his face, but Dolly always remembered how conspicuous the wedding ring looked on his mangled left hand. She sat beside her husband's remains, cradling the two daughters in her arms while the wagon swayed, creaked, and bounced on its way toward Richmond. In Richmond, they sent Dolly and the children to the home of Hill's uncle, who they stayed with during the sick furlough. Looting destroyed much of the businesses, and Frank Hill went from building to building looking for a coffin. He found a plain pine coffin and brought it to the paymaster's office. They removed his gauntlets, washed the dirt from his face, wrapped the body in his army coat, and placed it in the coffin. When they got the body to Henry Hill's home, they then needed to find a burial place. No city officials could be found to place Hill in Hollywood Cemetery in Richmond, so their second choice was Culpeper, his hometown, but attempting to transport the unembalmed body such a long distance in warm weather was impracticable. Dolly and the family decided to bury him near the estate and then, at a later time, bury him with his parents in Culpeper. A member of the family and a family slave constructed a rough case for the coffin, and he was interred in the Old Winston family cemetery. On June 6 of that year, in Culpeper, Dolly gave birth to a child. She hoped it would be a son to give him his father's name, but it was another daughter. She named her Ann Powell Hill, A.P. Hill, the initials of her father. Dolly returned to her family in Kentucky the next month. According to one of her daughters, she was very averse to talking of anything connected with the war. A pardon from the federal government in May 1866 did nothing to soften Dolly's bitterness over the struggle that had taken her husband's life. In 1867, a group of veterans from Hill's staff and former Confederate officers met to discuss the removal of Hill's remains from the private cemetery to Hollywood Cemetery. The family gave somewhat of a consent, and he was buried in Lot N35. No headstone was erected, just the words Lieutenant General A.P. Hill cut into the curbing in front of the grave. The next year, Ann Powell Hill died and was buried in the Lexington Cemetery. After the death, Dolly grew more bitter about the Civil War. She even dropped her nickname Dolly that Hill affectionately called her and used her name Kitty from then on. Many widows of Confederate generals chose not to wed again. As one of Hill's biographers stated, Kitty was too embittered by the war and too full of life to accept self-imposed martyrdom on behalf of the Southern Confederacy. She would marry a Louisville physician named Alexander Forsyth and give him 2 children, but that marriage also was short-lived. Alexander would die on September 8, 1875. She and her daughters would live with Kitty's mother, Henrietta Morgan, in Lexington, Kentucky. Meanwhile, in October 1870, Robert E. Lee had died in Lexington, Virginia. Stonewall Jackson had called for Hill with his dying words. So did Lee. On the morning before he expired, the delirious commander's mind wandered back to the battlefields of the Great Civil War. He mumbled intermittently. A loud cry occasionally passed his lips. Then, in words plainly heard and understood by everyone in the room, Lee emphatically stated, "Tell Hill he must come up." It was the last intelligible thing Lee said until his remark at the moment of death, "Strike the tent." In 1887, multiple veteran groups with Major Lewis Ginter, a former member of Hill's staff, took the lead in getting a statue erected in honor of Hill with Hill's remains underneath it. It was not planned to be placed along with Jackson and Lee on Monument Avenue, but to be displayed in a residential section of the west side of the city, with the Hill Memorial as its centerpiece. When the base was ready for the remains of Hill, the group went to Hollywood Cemetery to dig up the remains, but were stopped by the superintendent of the cemetery, who required written authorization from the widow, which the group promptly got. They dug up the remains and placed the body in the concrete tomb at the intersection of Laburnum Avenue and Hermitage Road. The monument unveiling took place on May 30th, 1892, with around 15,000 people in attendance, which included a 2-hour parade. The only representative of the family was Lucy Lee Hill. Kitty could not attend. Kitty outlived her husband and many of her children, passing away on March 20th, 1920. All of Hill's daughters died without having children, so A.P. Hill's bloodline died in 1931 when Lucy passed away. Charles Venable of Lee's staff stated of Hill, "In him fell one of the knightliest generals of that army of knightly soldiers. On the field he was the very soul of chivalrous gallantry. In moments of the greatest peril his bearing was superb and inspiring in the highest degree. The name of A.P. Hill stands recorded high on the list of those noble sons of Virginia, at whose roll call grateful memory will ever answer, dead on the field of honor, for the people they loved so well." Chaplain J. William Jones wrote about Hill shortly after the war that, "And though he knew no tender care as did Jackson, no weeping friends as did Stuart, the swift-winged messenger of death left neither wanting. His death groan was lost in the roar of battle, his death couch moistened with the blood of his comrades, and for his requiem was heard the nation's wail.
Historian, historian, where do you roam? Historian, historian, far, far from home. Have history will travel reads the card of a man, a professor with knowledge in the heartland. To educate the world is his mission. A professor of fortune is a man called historian. Historian.